Thank you everybody for joining us this morning, both the people who are with us in person here at Kinnot Alei Tzion, everybody joining the United Synagogue web program as well. And we're going to be reading some of the Kinot and studying some of the themes associated with the Kinot as we go through the course of the morning. As I've said on previous occasions, Kinot aren't just a tefillah. With tefillah we have a din that even if you don't understand what you're saying, you're actually yotzei. It's the notion of engaging with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, standing in front of him and speaking to him, and even if we don't understand every word, one still fulfills the obligation. With Kinot it's different. Kinot, the purpose of Kinot is that we should feel the Defilement, is that we should study and learn about what happened. Rabbi Eicha actually says that the Kinot is what he calls a kiyum of the Defilement on Tisha B'Av, meaning that if you say the Kinot without understanding what they're about and without having an appreciation for the tragedies that have befallen Am Yisrael and for the tragedy and the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, then one hasn't properly fulfilled the mitzvah. And therefore, rather than just going through the Sefer Kinot from beginning to end and just saying every Kinah without understanding the words, we're going to actually study together some of the themes. The words of the Kinot are very, very difficult. They were written by the ancient Paitanim, many of them by the Kalir, who wrote in a very poetic way, making very many references to the various Pesukim and Midrashim that we're not at all familiar with, using linguistic structures that are incomprehensible to us, and then we have to study about them before we're able to understand them. What I want to do during the course of the morning is to really study a number of themes as we go through and intersperse them with the Kinot. What we've done in recent years is we've started off the Kinot study session with actually a short share on the halachot Habelut. Today we're going to be learning the topic of Isu Yitzia Mipetach Beito. Many people are familiar that when a person's sitting shiva, they're not allowed to leave the house. That's one of the reasons why they daven in the shiva house. If you're davening, if the sitting shiva is taking place in the house of the niftar, then in any event there's an inyan to have the minyan there. And in actual fact, halachah is what do you do if there's person dies and they've got no close relatives? Sometimes it happens that the person dies, they've got no close relatives, so obviously there's no shiva. Nevertheless, the Shulchan Aruch says you should have a minyan of people come to that house every day. They should learn Torah in that house and they should daven in that house, because there's a notion that the neshama of the deceased person is still present in that place. But so obviously, if the shiva is taking place in the house of the niftar, then one wants to have the tefillah in that house. If a person's sitting shiva in their own home rather than in the home of the niftar, why don't they go to shul in the mornings for tefillah? Why don't they go to shul for mincha mariv every day? And one of the answers is because there's an Isu Yitzia Mipetach Beito. An Avel is not allowed to leave their home during the course of the shiva week. Shamshan Raphael Hirsch in Chorev, he explains that what are the characteristics or what are the reasons for all the prohibitions of sitting shiva. And he says the main common denominator is the fact that we want to withdraw from society. An Avel wants to be focused on their own thoughts, focused on thinking of the niftar, and doesn't really want to be engaged with people around them so much. That's why they allow themselves to look unkempt, because they're not really bothered what other people think about them. They've turned their thoughts inwards. That indeed is one of the reasons why we turn the mirrors round or cover the mirrors, because a mirror is projecting something outwards and we want the Avel to be thinking inwards. So the same would be true about Isu Yitzia Mipetach Beito, that going out into the shuk, into the marketplace, meeting people is an engagement with society, and we want to restrict that engagement with society during the course of Shiva. So I want us to start by looking at the Gemara in Masechet Moed Katan, third parak of Moed Katan. The poskim say that on Tisha B'Av, amongst the themes that one's learned, the parak of Elu Magalchim, the third parak of Moed Katan, which deals with the laws of Avilut. And Tisha B'Av is a day of Avilut Yishana, a day of Avilut when we remember things that took place 2,000 years and 2,500 years ago. But also, we're allowed to learn about Avilut Chadasha. We're allowed to learn about contemporary Avilut, the Avilut that the person experiences when they lose a relative. And that's what I want us to start with now. So we're going to start by looking at the sugya here in Moed Katan, Daf Kaf Gimel Amud Bet. And the Gemara says as follows, Tanu Rabbanan, so we have a brighter. Avel Shabbat Rishona, Yotzei Mipetach Beito, Eino Yotzei Mipetach Beito. An Avel during the first week after the death of a relative doesn't leave their home. Shniya Yotzei Ve'eino Yoshev Bimkomo. The second week, they're allowed to leave home, but they don't sit in their regular place. Now, of course, it's not clear what we mean by not sitting in their regular place. It might well mean, or it certainly means at least in shul or in areas of prominence, of kavod, then you don't sit in your normal important seat and you retreat a little bit. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Shlishit, the third week, Yoshev Bimkomo, Ve'eino Medaber. The Avel is allowed to sit in their regular seats in shul or in gatherings, but Ve'eino Medaber, they don't speak in the normal way. They listen quietly and they don't fully engage with what's happening. Revi'it Harehu K'chol Adam. The fourth week, then they're like everybody. We're on page 2 of the Kuntras. I think perhaps some of them didn't print properly, and perhaps some people haven't got page 2. But if you've got page 2, that's where we are. So Revi'it, the fourth week, Harehu K'chol Adam. Everything returns to normal. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, but Rabbi Yehuda says, we don't need to say that the first week the Avel doesn't leave home, because the Avel's sitting shiva and everybody comes to greet the Avel and to console the Avel. So obviously the Avel's not going anywhere. It's the second week that the Avel doesn't leave home. The third week the Avel leaves but doesn't sit in their regular seat. The fourth week, the Avel leaves the house, sits in their regular place, and doesn't speak in the regular way. The fifth week, which is, of course, after the conclusion of the Shloshim, after the Avilut is concluded, so then everything reverts to normal. And what we see here, of course, is a model of a gradual re-engagement with society. And this model of sort of gradual shift in Avilut is something which we're very familiar with. As we're familiar with the notion of, the Shiva week, and in that, in actual fact, the first day of Avilut, which we regard as being, many poskim regard as being the Doraita, the first 3 days of Shiva, which are in many respects more stringent than other days of Shiva, the whole week of Shiva, the Shloshim, the Yud Beit Chodesh, the 12 months of Avilut, etc., etc. So we see a gradual shift in the intensity of Avilut, and that's what we're seeing here, a shift in the intensity of Avilut. So in any event, what we've got here is a model for a shift, but what we're seeing is certainly the first week and possibly the second week, the Avel is not allowed to be Yotzei Mipetach Beito. What I want to do is to go through the Shulchan Aruch on this halacha and see what we can glean and we can establish from it in a practical sense. So let's look on page 3 at Simon Shin Tzadik Gimel in Yoredaya, which deals with these halachot. So Seif Aleph says, Avel Gimel Yamim Harishonim, Eino Yotzei Leveit HaAvel V'lo Leveit HaKvarot. So an Avel during the first 3 days of Avilut, even if they've got a friend who's sitting shiva and they would want to go and visit the friend sitting shiva, they don't do so. Even if they've got a levaya, perhaps somebody from the shul passed away during the first 3 days of their shiva, they really wanted to go to the levaya and show a kavod to the niftar, they're not allowed to do so. Mikan va'ilach, but after that point, if a neighbor lost a relative, then he can join the funeral procession. You don't join the people who are extending condolences. But because you're sitting shiva yourself, you sit together with the people who are being consoled, with the mourners. And also there's a halacha that if there's a levaya taking place and there aren't enough people to support the levaya and to be present as there should be, then then even on the first day you can go out, and even if the levaya is taking place far away. So it could be, you live in a small community which doesn't have many people left, one of the small dwindling provincial communities, a person's sitting shiva, and that week there's another levaya, and there's barely a minyan to go to the levaya without you, so then you can go and make up the numbers. Let's go on to Seif Bet. Avel Shavua Harishon Eino Yotzei Mipetach Beito Afilu Lishma Birchot Chuppah or Birchot Milah. So the first week of Avilut, an Avel doesn't leave home, even if it's for a mitzvah. Not a mitzvah that the Avel himself is absolutely doing, but being present at the mitzvah. This is an interesting notion. Why would I have thought that it's permissible? I know, fine, my neighbour's getting married, during the course of the week. Why would I think that I'm allowed to go and listen to the brachot, or my neighbour's making a brit milah? Why would I have thought that it's permissible for an Avel to leave the shiva house to go and attend to the brit milah? If the Avel's not not a member of the immediate family, what we're seeing from this, again, a topic for another time, but it seems that going to listen to these brachot is a mitzvah in itself. It's just being present at the brit milah and listening to the brachot, or just being present at the wedding and saying amen to the sheva brachot under the chuppah is a mitzvah in itself. The other's not allowed to do that. So even if it's for a mitzvah, that's the point that we're making, even if it's for, I would say, a small mitzvah, it's not permissible. We'll talk in a moment about for a more significant mitzvah. For a small mitzvah, the Avel's not allowed to leave the house during shiva. The Rama says, Mihu hameka lapsik balayla mipnei hatzorech lo hifsid. So this is based on a Trumat Hadeshem, that if the Avel leaves at night during the week of his Avelut, because it's necessary, then that's not such a big deal. And we'll look in a moment at the Tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein on that. The prohibition against the other leaving home is just, wants to go for a walk around the block, or wants to go to work or something like that. But if the context here is, you've been summoned by the governor of the area or something like that, or you've got to go somewhere which is really necessary. If it's something you're going to lose from, if you don't do it, then you're allowed to, the Avel is allowed to go. So, it could be that an Avel, say, has got a court appearance. They've been summoned to court during the week of Shiva. If they can't push it off, they would be allowed to go. Sometimes it happens that an Avel has got a court appearance or something like that. So then they're also, not a court, a hospital appointment, something like that. Then they would also be allowed to go during the week of Shiva. So if it's very, very pressing, they would be allowed to go. The question that often comes up is that all the Avelim are sitting Shiva in one house, in the house of the Nifta, say, but they want to go home to their own homes at night to sleep. So if we look back at the previous page, back on page 2, there's the tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein in Niglot Moshe Yoredea, Chelet Bet Simon Kuf Ein Bet, where he refers us to a Chaya, the Chochmat Adam, who says that the Avelim are allowed to go home at night to sleep in their own beds. Vlachim Baruch She'emar She'b'Chochmat Adam, Klal Kuf Samachei Seif Yudalef Ita She'mutarim B'Layla Leich Lishon B'Vatehem, Huletzorech Davka. Okay, it's only if they really need to. If it's just that sort of they fancy going home and having a bit of time at home without the rest of the family or something like that, it would seem that it's not permissible. But if there's not enough space for everybody to sleep in the Shiva house, then it would be permitted. So he says that you can't give absolute objective definitions of what sorech is in this case. It depends on the person's particular needs. שיש בני אדם שאין יכולים לישון במקום אחר, שלא הורגלו, שגם זה אולי נחשב לצורך. Some people, they sleep terribly if they're not in their own bed. Always in people, that's first 3 nights they're away on holiday, they sleep terribly, they're not in their own bed. So if you're that type of person, then that would be regarded as a tzorech during shiva week. It has to be mipnei hatzorech, not just because it's a bit more convenient. Okay, we'll all go home at night and sleep in our own beds, and we'll come back, sometime tomorrow. So you need to go home at the time. This is more relevant sort of when people would walk out in the streets. Now you just get into a car, and it shouldn't make a difference. But the Igrot Moshe is saying that essentially it should have been that when you're not going to be bumping into a lot of people on the way, and you're not going to be traveling with a big group of people. So we see that Tzorech you can relocate during the week of Shiva. You can even go on the journey if necessary. This is something which comes up not infrequently, that people they go abroad for the Levaya, and then during the week of Shiva they want to come back home and sit Shiva at home, so they can be experienced with Nichum Avelim from their friends, and that would seem to be permissible from this Ramah. And then the Shulchan Aruch says, Shniya yotzei ve'enu yoshev b'mkomo ve'enu medaber, Shlishit yoshev b'mkomo ve'enu medaber. So paskening like the first view in the Shulchan Aruch. What's this Einu yotzei b'mkomo? Einu yoshev b'mkomo. So if you just look at the bottom of the page, I've marked there the Gilyon Maharsha. This was written by the son of Rabbi Akiva Eicha. Ve'enu yoshev b'mkomo ve'en b'veitor ve'en b'veit HaKnesset. So interestingly, the Avel, when there's a din of not sitting in their regular seat, they don't sit in their regular seat in shul or at home. So I don't know if we necessarily run our homes like this nowadays, but certainly in olden times, perhaps the master of the house, I don't know if we still have masters of the house, but in a day when there was a master of the house would have his chair, and that's where he would sit, and nobody else would dare to sit there. And that's a position of kavod in the house. And therefore, during the week of Shiva, and even after the week of Shiva, the Avel's not supposed to sit there. But if you're somewhere where people are sat in order of precedence and priority, seniority, so then you can sit in your regular seat. You don't need to give up your seniority. The Ramah continues at the top of page 4. So if in the third week, when you're supposed to be sitting in your regular seat, but not speaking in the regular way, you want to swap that round, then that's fine. The point is that it's a gradual reintroduction to society. So the Ramah says nowadays you've got a minhag that Avelim don't sit in their regular seat in shul for the whole 30 days of Avelut, and in actual fact, if they're mourning for parents when the Avelut exists for a full Yud Beit Chodesh, so then they don't sit in their regular seat for the full Yud Beit Chodesh. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says that an Avel during the year when they move their seat, they should move further away from the Aron HaKodesh. So they shouldn't. It's sort of a sense of retreating from a position of significance in the shul. That's where you want to move to. And the poskim say that you should move at least daled amot, at least a distance of 4 amot. You don't need to move right to the other side of the shul, but you do need to move somewhat. So I've got back on page 2. I've got a tshuva here of the Maharam Shik. The Maharam Shik was a Talmud of the Chatam Sofer, and the Maharam Shik is addressing the question: what about the Rav of a Kehillah? Comes up, the Rav of the Kehillah is in Avelut. Does he move his seat in shul, or should he retain his regular seat? It also comes up in shuls where there's a warden's box and you've got the Gabayim. So do the Gabayim move seat when they're in Avelut or not? So He says, so the Maramshik says when he was an Avel, his father, he moved his seat a little bit. He didn't move it, he didn't go right to the other side of the shul, but he moved a little bit. He says the reason why I moved a bit was because I didn't move properly. He says because he's uncertain. That's a Rav. Part of the position of Rabbanut is that the Rav gets a special seat in shul. So why does the Rav get a special seat? It's not only for kavod of the Rav, but it's also for kavod of the tzibur, so that the tzibur can feel that they've got somebody important sitting at the front of the shul. It makes them, I'm told, that it makes people feel important. When you come into shul, you see a choshev roh sitting at the front of the shul. It gives you a sense of pride in your shul. So then maybe the Rav is not allowed to move his seat because it's not just his seat, but this is something for the kavod of the tzibur. But guests will come into the shul, they'll see the Rav's not sitting there. They'll say, it's a shul without a rabbi. It's a hefgeveld. Because he didn't want to be Mavatel, the kavod of the. So then he goes on to discuss about Shabbat, and the Bircha Yosef brings down. Also, he didn't. When I was an Avel for my own father, Alav HaShalom, that's exactly what I did. Where it was, just a couple of inches, so it was not really noticeable, except the Maram Shik, and so I'd moved. Still gave the Kavod Bahesia. We'll come to in just a moment. Continuing in the Machabali. It's not full. Lapsed, don't shemei be'etzah shavua, miyad kishkaleh oto shavua, chashiv shavua huruvi. So he says the way we count the weeks is not the first week is till the first Shabbat, the second week is till the second Shabbat, etc. Then if Gimel, the shul, but on the shul, the Beit HaMikdash is the same. In fact, the Yael doesn't even go for Kriyat HaTorah. There are a number of opinions in the Rishonim. Some Rishonim say that the Yael can go to shul for Kriyat HaTorah, some that can't go for Kriyat HaTorah. Machloket about Shabbat. So it seems but does go on Shabbat. So the question comes up: sometimes. What if it's not possible to get a minyan in the home of the Avel? Again, if you're in a small community, it's sometimes difficult to get a shiva minyan in the house of the Avel and also in the Beit Knesset at all. They struggle for a minyan every day. It's going to be difficult to get a minyan in two places. Sometimes this comes up. People discuss it. Should we? What should we do? Minyan to the shiva house? I don't think that's right. I don't think that's good because if there's always a minyan in shul, then you shouldn't. We know what it's like to be goleh from the shul in the course of the past year. There should always be the tzmidim in the shul. If it's a largish community where just people are a bit lazy and don't come to shul very much, so then when somebody's sitting shiva, you need to make a few phone calls and twist some arms that people who don't usually come. You'll go to the shiva house and make up the shiva. If you're in a small, you've got 10 Jews or 12 Jews and that's it, you're not going to get a minyan in both places. So can the Avel go to shul to say Kaddish? So look in the Kiddush Rabbi Akiva called, but in who Avel so a person's and after he looks at their parents. And parents, even in Mutale go to maybe the prohibition against so strict that even whilst you're sitting shiva to go and say Kaddish, you're not allowed to leave. He's not sure. He says it's the Pitkei Tshuva. The Pitkei Tshuva says, so it's the reason why you don't go is because there's a mitzvah to daven shiva. It's in a case where worth noting. Some people think, that an Avel, it's so important they get to shul to say Kaddish. An Avel gets to say to shul to say Kaddish. It's also important Avel gets to shul to say to respond to Kiddush and Baruch. In those cases, mutar leilei. So it's permissible for him to go to shul. Achmagin Abraham mashma. I think that nowadays you're going in the car to shul. If it's in a place where there's no minyan, I think it's all right for the Avel to go by car to shul because it's not really Yitziar HaShul. There's no somebody going to mingle or mix with other people. Let's just finish off with Ramah there. Avel model or Baal Brit so what is the Avel? A model or Baal Brit? They're needed. So daven at home and then go to shul for the Brit. The Brit would always take place in shul. But if it's during the first 3 days, which are more strict, then unless there's no other moil in town, then the Avel doesn't go. The moil shouldn't go out. Right, let's just finish off by looking at Seif Hay, which talks about Shinui Makom, changing your place in shul even on Shabbat. And arguing Shema Abelim Shelu Shanot Lukomah Beit HaKnesset Shabbat, Yafer Hem Osim. So Abelim who don't change their seats in shul on Shabbat, so that's good practice because it would be Abelut Farhesh, it would be a public form of Abelut on Shabbat. If Avel doesn't sit in their regular seat and there's a prohibition against Abelut Farhesh on Shabbat, how can the Avel sit in their Abelut seat on Shabbat? So the Machaber Paskins, but the Avel shouldn't sit in an Abelut seat during on Shabbat. However, the Ramah says that even on Shabbat the Avel should check their seat. That is the general minhag Even on Shabbat, the Avel sits somewhere else. So we've still got a question then, why is it regarded as Avelut Parhesia? So look in the Shach Sifkatan Zayin says as follows. So even on Shabbat, the Avel moves his seat. So the Rama obviously thinks this isn't public Avelut. But how can it not be public Avelut? Avelut change their seats. She'ein Avelut nikar b'zeh kol kach. It's not so obvious that it's Avelut. שהרבה פעמים אדם מחליף מקומו, אפילו אינו אבל עד כאן שלו, because often an avel will sit somewhere else, even if they're not, a person will sit in a different seat, even if they're not an avel. It comes to somebody else is in your seat. There's a person who sits next to you, got their son with them or a guest with them for Shabbat. So you say, okay, fine, I'll go and sit somewhere else, I don't mind. Or there's a simcha, you want to go and sit alongside the Baal Simcha or something like that. So people move their seats in any event. So the fact that you're not sitting in a particular seat isn't necessarily an expression of Avelut. That's the first answer. Second answer that he says, referring to the Luke Yosef, the Avelut nohei kol shloshim nohei gachim b'Shabbat v'lav that every say that Avelut Parhesia is prohibited on Shabbat, that's only talking about a particular type of Avelut. That's only talking about the Avelut of Shiva. The Avelut of Shloshim applies on Shabbat. I approve of that. Somebody, I think it was last year, before somebody asked me, how is it that during the 3 weeks you can go to shul on Shabbat not having shaved? You look like you're Avelim. It's the whole and during Shloshim. That they look like Avelim. So it's clear, nobody says that Avel during Shloshim should shave on a Friday so it doesn't look like Avelut. How can it be that they can shave, that they can come to shul looking unkempt? The answer is that the prohibition of Avelut, the Parhesia on Shabbat, only applies to a form of Avelut which is limited to Shiva. If it's not limited to the Shiva, so it doesn't apply during on Shabbat. There's also actually makes a difference. Says the Avel should sit in their regular seat on Shabbat, but only on Friday night. Because Friday night you're already sitting in your non-Shabbat seat for Minchas. You come from you sit in your regular seat. You don't need to move back. But Shabbat morning you should sit in your regular seat. But I think the minhag is that the Avel doesn't sit in their regular seat even on Shabbat. Something to flag up, I haven't really noticed, but I pointed out to people on vacation, is that very often women don't change their seat when they're in Avelut. They should do. A woman who's in Avelut, someone can come to shul very much, because a woman who comes to shul every week, she's got a regular seat in shul, so then she should move her seat and sit somewhere else on Shabbat. So to tie this in with Tisha B'Av, I think this isn't just a matter of academically that we're learning Hilchot Avelut, and there's a key of that. But to tie it in with Hilchot Tisha B'Av, the question comes up, of course, why is it that there's no Issa Yetziah Mipetach Beitor on Tisha B'Av? So we say, okay, you're not allowed to go to Tayel, you're not allowed to go out, this afternoon you fancy going to the Science Museum or something like that. That's not allowed. After shul, you want to go and pick something up from Bikosha or whatever it is for after the fast, or you need to go somewhere, for whatever reason, there's no nobody says that on come to shul. I don't say we should have garden minyan on the street on Tisha B'Av. Everybody just doubles in a minute of 10 people. Pesach because we're not mingling with people who aren't Avelim in anything. We're all Avelim, and that's what Tisha B'Av is about. It's the sense of communal Avelut for the function of the Beit HaMikdash. We're going to now read the first Kinot. First Kinot on page 195 in the Koren, page 91 in the Rosenfeld, and 152 in the Art Scroll. This Kinot is actually, it's only half a Kinot. So the first half of the Kinot was traditionally said in Chazar Hashatz, and it goes according to the Aleph Beit, which starts at Samach. Shabbat Suru, many. Samach there. Because Samach is in the middle of the Aleph Beit. What happened to Aleph through Nun? So the answer is that was in Chazar Hashatz. Many Kinot used to say krobets on special occasions. Insertions into each of the brachot of the Amidah. You can see it in the Rosenfeld, they're still there. Very few places say them nowadays. So this is a continuation of the that view which started in Chazar Hashatz, and it's really talking about how downtrodden Jewish people felt when Yerushalayim was destroyed. And one of the things that we're going to see as we go through the Kinot, and I think I flag this up every year, is the fact that the Kinot were written they were written hundreds of years ago, and this Kinot by the Kalir was written well over 1,000 years ago. Nobody really knows exactly when the Kalir lived, but it might be 1,500 years ago. That's for events that took place 2,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago. And these are still things which happen today. They've got contemporary relevance. As you look in that first line, that's they made me a scum and refuse among the flocks of my companions. A typical trope of anti-Semites is to call people they don't like to call Jews scum. I mean, that's racism in general. People say they don't like that they call scum. But that's an experience of Jewish life throughout the centuries of being called scum there. And this is how they felt at the time of the Korban Habayit. And it's these insults, this sense of humiliation that we're going to discover during the course of this breath.
Shavasuru many shimoni oifrai, Sechiumai, Sesimoni be'ezrei chaveirai, Sakaisa mishkan mischais to be rai, Sakaisa v'huglagu givairai, Saku chapu moadu evarai, Kisila chol abirai, Nafla oideinu b'tzuduchuya, Eini tikasol achazoi ben berechya, Ad Gilgal Abuya, Eini me'oiles, Bibonis Nechuya, Asav Nicha, Vanikra Labechya, Benoma Leile Ani Voichia, Ad Pnei Feras, Nubetsu Chasiteha, Palgesuf Zochra Kara, Shilai Tochaf Soideha, Patu Chazire Ya'ar Aye Chasideha, Patu Maasei Erva Lindeha, Pesarti Ay Beyadeha, Ala parts of the Shonei Madonai, Sofu Al Roshi Zaydonai, Som Subenai Lamai Zaydonai, Soy Notras Loirer Madonai, Sawakami Bimei Vendinai, Tadiku Adonai. Ata kalim ichpadata u'edrei ermuni kerafdoi boy elai v'yacharimuni karasi yoshvei givoi nodheim zermuni koilila ashmiya ba'arav higrimuni kumi avoiri behosei herimuni karasi lamavai heimarimuni lamaru achapenu latevach shamaru Raisa ki kasaner irenu chamaru Raisa ki amal bochas be'im chagamaru Rafta b'yadeches kelin kaim kamay maru Re'ei v'nachidei migay amaru Re'ei Adonai ki tzari meyai Chatzeirai lahad kieni Sipsei Misharei Devir Daimamu Lahadaini Shomata Zumairais Abhechil Letat Aini Shafu Nadu Katsas Lahavriani Shamuki Nanachani Hitam Chata Bechais Oifanecha Tashiv Lohem Gumul Gaos Chazois Panecha Tidoi B'Tzamoy Yoad Seira Antufunecha Titain Lahavhav Nois Seifininecha Tikralish Shakram Kais Komus Bifinecha Tavai Chodrasam Lefanecha Tavai Elsar Asher Kilanu Limdoi Hamas Bechemon Nihalanu Ad Lachalas Vechavar Higlanu Takei Vachar Vesula Kavalanu Ram Habed no Amcha Cholanu Zachar Adonai Mehayalanu.
The second of the Kinot that we will discuss today, or that we will read today, the second of the Kinot begins Eicha Atzta V'Apecha, and the term Eicha, of course, is a key term, key motif in Tisha B'Av. A number of the Kinot begin with the word Eicha. I want to spend a little bit of time considering what does that word Eicha mean. The classic Mefarshim and the Midrashim say that Eicha is two words, Eiko. How could it be that this has happened? And Rav Soloveitchik explains that this term Eiko is really what he calls the matir of Tisha B'Av. It's what allows us to challenge HaKadosh Baruch Hu on Tisha B'Av. A lot of the Kinot, the theme is not just mourning, but it's asking the Almighty, how could it be that this thing has happened to the Jewish people? And he makes the observation that, generally speaking, we're not allowed to ask that question of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Mishnah in Massacres Brachot tells us, that just as we praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu for what's good in our lives, we have to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu in exactly the same way for what's bad in our lives. Unflinchingly, we have to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So how can it be that on Tisha B'Av we're allowed to challenge HaKadosh Baruch Hu and say, hold on, this has gone too far? And he says that the Kinot on Tisha B'Av are an exception to the rule. If we look on what I've copied out on page 5, he says the case of Kinnot on Tisha B'Av, however, is an exception to the general rule. We are permitted to ask Eicha because we're following the precedent of Yirmiyahu the Navi, who posed the question Eicha in the book of Lamentations. And Jeremiah posed this question only because he was given a heter, special permission by God himself, who instructed him to write Eicha Yashva Badat, the first sentence of the book of Lamentations. In effect, God granted a unique privilege to Jeremiah to address himself to God with these otherwise impermissible questions and to write Kinot, Lamentations, in the form of the book of Lamentations. The reason that God granted permission to express these otherwise inappropriate questions is that Jeremiah was expressing mourning for the destruction of the temple, and this tragedy was so overwhelming that the prophet and anyone else was granted unlimited freedom to pose questions that would have been inappropriate under any other circumstances. Thus, Rabbi Eliezer Kaleh is permitted to address the question Eicha to God, only because that question was already posed to God by Jeremiah in Lamentations. So we find that the term Eicha, according to Rav Soloveitchik, is a question of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. How could he let this happen? And this is a unique question that we're able to ask on Tisha B'Av. We're not allowed to ask this question on any other occasion. So as far as Rav Soloveitchik is concerned, it's a question. This is the way most of the classical Mefarshim understand it. Eiko, how could this have happened to the Jewish people? And you look at that first line of Megillat Eicha, Eicha Yashva Badat Ha'ir Rabbatiyan. How could something that was so splendid, so glorious, so bustling, have become so quiet, so empty, so bereft of people? That's the question. But I want to look at some other thoughts on this term Eicha and the first line of Megillat Eicha. There's just been published this year a book called Lamentations, Faith in a Turbulent World, by Dr. Yael Ziegler, who's recently been appointed as the head of Matan Institute in Israel, and she's also part of Michlelet Herzog as well. We had Dr. Ziegler came to Alei Tzion a couple of years back as a scholar in residence, and she's an expert on Tanakh, and understanding the pshat in Tanakh. And she's just published a book with Koren this year on Megillat Eicha, which I think will be one of the very important works on Megillat Eicha in terms of understanding pshat of Megillat Eicha, well worth getting hold of, and really thoughtful insights into what the Navi is trying to tell us. And I want to start off by looking at her observations on the word Eicha, and she makes the observation that Eicha has a dual meaning. The term Eicha means it's both a lament and also it's a rebuke. That's functioning as a rebuke as well as lament. The word Eicha may always contain elements of both. Isaiah laments Jerusalem's fallen state, even as he castigates her betrayal of God. This was the Haftarah that we read yesterday for Shabbat Chazon, and they're both elements of it. It's a Haftarah of rebuke. And then she quotes a Medrash where we had actually a machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Nechemiah about the meaning of Eicha. Rabbi Yehuda says Eicha is a phrase of reproach, as it says, Eicha, how can you say we are wise and the Lord's instructions are with us? And Rabbi Nechemiah says it's a phrase of lament, quoting the pasuk or misquoting the pasuk in Parashat Bereshit of HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying to Adam HaRishon, Ayeka. Okay, Ayeka, that's where are you? But also being related or having the same letters as the word Eicha, and that was Rabbi Nechemiah says it's a lament, but she makes the observation that in actual fact it's much of a rebuke as a lament, what the Navi or HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to Adam HaRishon, and therefore it's both. And she says Rabbi Nechemiah is willing to sacrifice the simple meaning in order to communicate a crucial idea. His reading suggests that even when God reprimands, he's actually expressing a lament. God's love for his people and for Adam is so pervasive that all his rebukes are laced with sorrow. And this is something very, very special about HaKadosh Baruch Hu's relationship with Am Yisrael. HaKadosh Baruch Hu can't rebuke us without feeling pain at the fact that he has to rebuke us. We've got this notion of Imo Anochi B'Tzara. HaKadosh Baruch Hu shares in our pain, and even when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is the one who's imposing the pain on us, as it were, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's in pain about it himself. It's an lament that he has to do this. So Eicha is the book of Lamentations. It's also, I guess, a book of reproach. How could we have allowed this to happen to ourselves? So Eicha Yashva Badad. How is it that this city is sitting, Badad is sitting alone? If you turn over to page 7, she makes some fascinating observations about this term Badad, about this this notion of Yerushalayim sitting alone. The top right-hand corner. That's Eicha opens with the quiet sounds of devastation, the eerie echoes of an emptied city. Loneliness dominates the opening chords of the book, illustrated poignantly by the metaphor of the widowed city, the Almanah, and acknowledged explicitly by the use of the word Badad. Now she's going to teach us how the term Badad, how this Shoresh represents 3 different ideas, all of which are relevant to Tisha B'Av. Elsewhere in Tanakh, the word Badad describes a destroyed city, a social outcast, and a leper. The image of Yerushalayim sitting alone, Badad, evokes these usages, focusing attention on the pain of her desolation, the abandonment of her loved ones, and her pariah status within the world. The phrase Yashva Badad, also used about a leper, may allude to Jerusalem's culpability and sin, as noted by the Targum. So we see that this Eicha Yashva Badad, it's not just saying glibly, look how Yerushalayim is sitting by itself. It's alone. What does that mean? It means that it's a sense of desolation, alone, not just being by yourself, but emptiness. There's nothing around you, or in the case of Yerushalayim, there was nothing in Yerushalayim. Secondly, the abandonment of her loved ones, this sense that Am Yisrael has gone into Galut and there's nobody left there, and also the fact that the nations of the world no longer had interest or confidence in the Jewish people and the Jewish homeland. And of course, this is something that we've seen repeatedly throughout the centuries, that Jewish people and the Jewish state and Medinat Israel has had a pariah status. If we look at just the recent conflict 2-3 months ago in Gaza and in cities in Israel and in Yerushalayim, this notion of pariah status, we might have won the battle in Gaza, but in terms of winning the battle in the arena of public opinion, we certainly didn't win that. And Israel, Medinat Israel, and by extension, Israel, the Jewish people, were accorded pariah status, and this is something which is true even today. While the word Badad primarily conveys the city's dreadful loneliness, however, now she says something again fascinating. A positive biblical usage of the word refers to Israel's singularity. Balaam prophetically proclaims that Israel is a people that dwells alone, Am Levadad Yishkon, and is not reckoned among the nations, emphasizing Israel's uniqueness. And this word may simultaneously point us to the cause of Israel's loneliness and to its solution. If only Israel had appreciated its singularity amongst the family of nations, Israel's desire to blend into the community of nations, her refusal to maintain her divinely mandated uniqueness, has turned a blessing of singularity, Am Levadad Yishkon, into a curse of isolation, Yashva Vadad. So this is very important notion, Yashva Vadad. We should be a people alone, but not alone in terms of humiliation, not alone in terms of a pariah status. We should be a people which is alone because of our uniqueness with the relationship that we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and also in terms of our uniqueness with regard to the morality that we display to the world, the Am Segula, the Ner Lagoyim, and all these sorts of things. And perhaps there's a notion that it's always going to be one or the other. So we can choose. We'll always be Am Levadad Yishkon. The question is, how do we want that bedidut, or how do we want that singularity to manifest itself? Do we want to manifest itself? We can choose for it to manifest itself as us being a unique and special nation. If we fail to choose that, then perhaps we are badad, we're left alone, we're a pariah nation. So I think that's food for thought there. Then Ha'ira Batiam Hayataka Almana. Why is Yerushalayim compared to the Almana? An Almana is a widow, and of course the big problem with being compared to a widow is that widowhood never ends. A widow is somebody whose husband has passed away, and husband passed away, he doesn't come back. Is this suggesting to us that Yerushalayim, there's no hope for Yerushalayim, nothing's ever going to be restored? So Dr. Ziegler quotes Rashi, of course, who points out that, of course, the word in the pasuk is Hayata ka almana. It's like an almana. There's going to be a long period of separation, but ultimately things will be restored. It's not absolute widowhood. It's like widowhood. But let's see inside what our observations here are on the widowhood of Yerushalayim. The personification of Jerusalem, coupled with her human-like actions, such as sitting alone, crying and mourning, arouses empathy. Her widowhood evokes physical and economic helplessness. The Bible often specifies the widow as one who deserves particular attention and care. Strikingly, the city remains unnamed from the first 3 verses of the chapter. Her anonymity mirrors her widowed state, suggesting that the loss of her husband signifies her loss of identity. This is something which often happens with people who experience a bereavement, where it's a partner. Sometimes, a woman who's, her identity has been tied up so many years with the identity of her husband. When he passes away, her own identity disappears as well. And that's perhaps what we're saying here with Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim loses its identity with the absence of the Beit HaMikdash. Without the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, what is Yerushalayim? Is there any significant Tel Aviv if the Beit HaMikdash isn't there? I think there's a big difference between Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv, but that big difference is primarily because of the fact that the Beit HaMikdash was there. It's still the Makom HaMikdash. It's still got that Kedusha. If it didn't have that Kedusha, what difference would there be? So great, it had been once upon a time being the place of the Beit HaMikdash. If the Kedusha disappeared, then Yerushalayim would be nothing. You may as well have the capital of Israel somewhere else. And perhaps the reason why so many countries have not recognized Yerushalayim as the capital of Medinat Israel, maybe it's something to do with the fact they don't recognize the sanctity of Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim is the capital because of the sanctity. If you don't appreciate the sanctity, then you don't see why the capital needs to be Yerushalayim. Alternatively, God can be identified as the deceased husband of Jerusalem, in this case representing the nation. After all, Israel's relationship with God is often described within a matrimonial context. So she then goes on to discuss the question, how can it be that God is deceased? And obviously that's a very big theological challenge. But if you turn the page to page 8, nevertheless, the meaning underlying the image of Jerusalem's widowhood remains problematic. Is it possible that Jerusalem's metaphorical is like a deceased husband, never to return? Is Jerusalem's devastation hopelessly unalterable? The simile may reflect Jerusalem's state of mind in this chapter, her despair and her bleak outlook on the future. This is like other laments in this chapter. The Lord has placed me in the hands of those before whom I cannot rise. So this, what she's saying is that this simile of widowhood, hayataka almana, it's not widowhood in the sense that nothing's ever going to be restored, but it's the sense of loss that exists when widowhood hits. And I've seen this many occasions with widows, that their lives prior to their husband's death revolved around the husband, and then when the husband was gone, they're at a loss to what to do. And that is Yerushalayim. Yerushalayim revolved around the Beit HaMikdash, the spirituality. Once that's gone, what's left for Yerushalayim? Yeah, there's a city there, but so much is missing. So those are some thoughts of the thoughts on the meaning of the phrase Eicha, or the word Eicha, and the first pasuk of Megillat Eicha. We're now going to read the second of our Kinot today on page 93 in the Rosenfeld, 217 in the Koren, 159 in the Art Scroll. And this is one of a number of what we will call compare and contrast Kinot. We're comparing how the Jewish people have been berated and punished by HaKadosh Baruch Hu with the promises and the love that HaKadosh Baruch Hu showed us on previous occasions. And our response after each line is Zechor Hashem Mehaya Lanu. From that last, the opening phrase of the last parak of Eicha, Hashem, remember what has happened to us. Hashem was so good to us. We had such a close relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu previously, and now that has been lost. 1, 2, 3, 4 lines in, four stanzas in. We have V'lo zachata chitun chukei chorev. We talk about that chitun chukei chorev, the chatuna, the marriage we have with HaKadosh Baruch Hu because of what was given to us as Har Chorev, the Seret HaDivrot, which were inscribed. It's Torah Siva Lanu Moshe, Morasha Kilat Yaakov. We don't read it as Morasha, but we read it as Morasa. So we're reminding HaKadosh Baruch Hu, now we're like a widow. Once upon a time, we were married to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, think back to that relationship that we had, and please try and restore it for us. Gidon will read the next.
Eicha atztov apecha labeit miyad adam mimemunecha v'lezochar tzobrispein habesorim asher beirarto libchunecha v'chein bitinu
Zochor Adonai.
Eicha va'arto v'ga'arosecha liglos biyad v'im gulecha v'lezocharto diligas diluk derech asher dolakto litkolecha v'chein dibarnu
Zochor Adonai.
Eicha hakto v'hegyonecha lahadef biyad hululim hamonecha v'lezocharto biyud v'ses asher biyadto liftutecha v'chein v'konanu Zochor Adonai. Eicha zonachto b'zamecha lizalzel biyad zorim zbulecha v'lezocharto chitun chukei chorev asher chokakto lachamulecha v'chein chivinu
Zochor Adonai.
Eicha torachto b'torchecha litrof biyad torfim tlohecha v'lezocharto yikar yitidus yosher asher yichatto liyodecha v'chein yolalenu Zochor Adonai. Eicha kivanto b'chasecha lechalos biyad kirim kormecha v'lezocharto lo liznach l'olam asher limadto lilkuchecha v'chein lo hagnu Zochor Adonai. Eicha milalto b'maasecha limchos biyad monim minasecha v'lezocharto nisias nutzas nesher asher nososo linsuecha v'chein nohinu Zochor Adonai. Eicha safto b'sarecha l'sager biyad seafim sahadecha v'lezocharto os adiadoim asher itarto la'avodecha v'chein oninu Zochor Adonai. Eicha pasto b'bachtecha l'fager biyad koritim bliecha v'lezocharto tzahalas tzvi tzadik asher tzofanto litzvoecha v'chein tzoaknu Zochor Adonai. Eicha koroso b'kriosecha liknos biyad komim kruecha v'lezocharto regesh rechev ribosayim asher rotzi sol reecha v'chein rodananu Zochor Adonai. Eicha shachto v'shafecha l'shalos biyad shel din shleimecha v'lezocharto tokef Alei Tzion asher tikanto lismimecha v'chein to'ananu Zochor Adonai. To'ananu lishbot tzmaos kamayim al mebiim ze nishbinu pamayim zochri b'hiyosi v'shalvo yesheves b'Yerushalayim roganti v'to'adeh ad chuk shamayim.
The next Kinot that we're going to be looking at will be that we'll be reading is the Kinot Zochor Asher Asar Bifnim, which is on page 111 in the Rosenfeld, 226 in the Art Scroll, and 361 in the Koren. And this is a description of how the Beit HaMikdash was defiled by the Roman Emperor Titus at the time of the Churban Bayit Sheni. This is based on the Gemara in Massacre Gittin and also various Midrashim, but describing how Titus broke in. It wasn't just a matter of wanting to destroy the Beit HaMikdash, but it was also a matter of wanting to humiliate the Beit HaMikdash. And in the early first two lines, we've got Zochor Asher Asar Bifnim, Shalach Charbol Vaya Lifnai B'Lifnim. So he unsheathed his sword and came into the Holy of Holies. Nachalatenu B8 kitimei lechem hapanim. He terrified what is our inheritance when he was matamei the lechem hapanim, the showbread, v'gider parochet ba'alat shtei fanim, and he pierced the parochet. So angry was he wanted to, as it were, kill HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The Gemara in Massacre explains how when Titus plunged his sword into the parochet bled, and Titus believed that he'd actually killed HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kivyachol, as it was. And that's one of the very significant imageries that we have here. We also have the description of him bringing a zona into the Beit Kodesh HaKodashim and consorting with the zona there. Again, this was gratuitous. This is again something that we see so often with racism and with anti-Semitism. Gratuitous things. It's not that he was benefiting in any way, but he wanted to show his contempt for the Beit HaMikdash. And then it goes on to describe how, according to Chazal, 300 children were sent to foreign lands, and when they realized that they were going to be raped and used for mishkav zachar, etc., that they committed suicide rather than effect. So this is the Kinot that we're going to read. This is the Kinot, I would say, of description of the Churban Habayit, and Rafi is going to lead us with this Kinot.
זכור אשר סצר בפנים, שלח קרבו לפני ולפנים, נחלתנו פרי עץ, כתמי לחם הפנים, בגדי פרוכת בעלת שתי פנים. יתומים גיל במגן מאדם, ימדת כף כמראה אדם דם, מימינו דלך, והשכיר חיציו מדם, יצא מן הבית וחרבו מלאה דם. על הגותו אבות גבר, ונטע אל ידו למולו לגבר, מצרים וכל לאום אשר בם עבר, ואני בתוך עיבויו ארץ אליו בצוואר. אבותינו זרע כהכניעו משרת, ולא מצא 93 כלי שרת. נשים כשרו קיבה אריץ, בקרקע בית נעליו החריץ, שרים לא פתו כבו פריץ, בבית קודש הקודשים תחנתו השריץ. בחורים מבחוץ סגו מחוזקים, בתרו כי יוזק ב60 ריבו מזיקים, זקנים נבחו כהרשו משתקים, עשות רצונו והוא אסור בזיקים. שבת סותן ויבוא אדמון, ויעש בית חומה ויבית המון, נפלה עברה על פני תצלח ולוס בארמון, עד קיננו תשמידו כארמון. על פתח הר הבית החל לבוא, ביד 4 ראשי תפסריו להחריבו, על צד מערבי לזכר השריבו, וצג אחר קצלנו ולא רב ריבו. אתה קצבת והרשית לפנות ילדים אשר אין בהם כל מאום משם להפנות, ולמה רגשו גויים ולא שתה אל המנחה פנות, ושילחום לארץ כוש ב3 ספינות. השיבנו שבעו קבעו בנבחי ים, ושיתפו עצמם יחד לנפול בים, שיר ותשבחות שורו קהל ים, כי עליך הורגנו במסולות ים, כי תמות באו עד נפשן, כל זאת בתנו ולא שכחנוך, חילו לממשן, תקוותם נתנו למשיב מבשן, וזאת כל נשמעה ורע למתישן.
The next Kinnot that we're going to read is on page 375 in the Koren, 220 in the Rosenfeld. When I think of how women could devour their own offspring, the children of their tender care, woe is me. This Kinnot is a Kinnot for the Shoah. We usually read the Kinnot for the Shoah at the end. This Kinnot was written again by the Kalir. It was written well over 1,000 years ago, maybe 2,000 years ago, 1,500 years ago, and still it's a Kinnot for the Shoah. Every year when we read this Kinnot, I'm struck by how Jewish history and the tragedies of Jewish history are just a repeating cycle, and what happens in one generation, just we've waited and then it happens again. You look through the descriptions here, is read, know the truth of these descriptions, and they happened at the time of the Churban Habayit, and they happened nearly 1900 years later in the times of the Shah. You look at the third line. When I think how the tresses of their heads could be cut off and tied to the adornment on the enemy's fleet horses. What was the first thing that happened when the Jews were taken to the camps? They were shorn of all their hair. That's description. What happened? When we think of the spirit of dead infants hovering over their swollen corpses that lie about the streets of the city, woe is me. We've all seen these pictures from the Shoah of corpses of young children, corpses of babies lying there swollen. From family. We've seen pictures of the carnage and the bodies from the concentration camps. These were described 1900 years perhaps, before they took place, or described certainly 1,000 years before they took place. When I think in exhaustion of how 10,000 were diminished to 100 and 100 to 10 and 10 to 1. You read about the Jewish communities of various places in Europe, which once upon a time, were enormous, and then the first transport happened, and their numbers were decimated. And then the second transport happened, and then the third transport, and you've got maybe one or two Jews left, and maybe no Jews left whatsoever. Towards the end, when we think of how the young men and maidens fainted through parching thirst, woe is me. Read the accounts of the roll calls in Auschwitz and in other camps. I read just this week, preparing material. I read about Buchenwald. How an account of a roll call, where people were made to stand out in the sun. We tend to think of Poland as being a cold country, but in the summer it can be very, very hot. The first time I went to Auschwitz, it was in the 9 days, and I went with a colleague. And the thing that struck me is you always think that, you always read these stories about, being cold and people being cold at the camps and huddling under blankets. A boiling hot day. I felt terrible. I had a bottle of water with me. When I was hot, I drank. Every time I drank, I thought, how can I drink when people were made to stand for roll calls for 12 hours, without being given anything to drink? I'm a bit thirsty, so I have a drink from my water bottle. That's exactly what's being described here. And I think of the young men and maidens fainting through parching thirst. The prophetic nature of this Kinnot every year strikes me, that it's not just a Kinnot for the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. I don't think it's even just a Kinnot for the destruction of European Jewry in the Shoah. I think this is probably something that's happened every time that Jewish communities were destroyed. This is probably what happened at the times of the Crusades. This is probably what happened as the exiles left Spain in 1492. This is something which was describing at the time one particular set of events, but can regrettably be applied to so many other sets of events. We'll continue with this now. Johnny will read it for us.
אם תאכל לנשים פריה מלא ציטוטים על הלילי, אם תבשל לנשים רחמניות ילדים המדודים טפחים על הלילי, ראשם ושישה ומסיסים חורפים על הלילי, אם תדבק לשונינך לחך וצימון צפיחים על הלילי, אם תהום נעזור ולמחזור, בואי נבשל לצנים חורפים על הלילי, אם תיעבד נעזור לזאת מדינך והוא חברים מנותח וצפים על הלילי, אם תזמנה בסעבות לבנים ונורות ושליחים על הלילי, אם תחויבנה בנות אל חקים אותם להתפחים על הלילי, אם תעשנה רוחות עלילי ברחבות קריאת צפופים על הלילי, אם תיעקינה בשיקול רחם וצימוק שייכים על בנים שפים על הלילי, אם תיקשה שמות מגידי בערב אלוקים על הלילי, אם תלוהקנה רוחם ובני מנוחים ונודות ופרופים על הלילי, אם תימקנה מלך 110 עד לאחד ומחכים על הלילי, אם תנסנו למסך אחד וחולים פרחים על הלילי, אם תשרפנה שם כל אותם הנפשות כקוצים כסופים על הלילי, אם תערפנה אדם נקי 80,000 חולים ומשוחים על הלילי, אם תפחנו נפשות מבוקרים בריח צנובות שפים על הלילי, אם תצברנה על אבן אחת 9 קווים מוחי ילדים מונחים על הלילי, אם תוקנה 300 יונקים על שפה אחת מטופים על הלילי, אם תראינה רכות וענוגות כבולות על יד רב חבכים על הלילי, אם תשכבנה בין שפתיים ובנות נדיבים משובחים על הלילי, אם תקרחנה הבנות והבחורים וצימון צפיחים על הלילי, ולרוח הקודש למעלה מרים חי על כל שכני הרעים, מה שיקרא מודיעין ואת אשר אסור לא מודיעין, ותאכל נשים פריה משמיעים ואם יהרס המקדש עד מה יקמאת ונביאים.
And the next Kinnot that we're going to read on page 123 in the Rosenfeld, 393 in the Koren, and 240 in the Art Scroll is another of the compare and contrast Kinnot, where we compare the wonderful things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done for the Jewish people over the course of the ages, with the ingratitude that we have displayed in response. And it goes through a whole list of things where we should have realized how gracious HaKadosh Baruch Hu has been to us, and we've been ungrateful. We start off with all the wonderful things that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has done for the Jewish people. The fact that we've rejected everything. We've been tested by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and we've failed. And lots of examples that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us the man, which tasted so wonderful in the desert, and now we're no longer able. We're ashamed that we're no longer able to give something back in response because there are no korbanot to give. We see that in the midbar we lacked nothing. We should be ashamed of the fact that in response to lacking nothing, what did we do? We rebelled against HaKadosh Baruch Hu 10 times. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us 14 judges to lead the people, And what did we do all the same? We set up Tzelem Micha and rebelled against HaKadosh Baruch Hu. This is one of the things that comparing and contrasting the graciousness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu through the centuries with the way that the Jewish people through the centuries have often not followed in his paths. So we continue with this Kinot. Simon is going to lead us with
it. Lanu b'shes apanim b'doifi asher nimtzavonu k'masei massacres. Lanu tzedakah v'hotel b'faydo le'olam. Lanu b'shes apanim v'yam ru al yam v'yam suf goy b'elahav b'fashah. Lanu tzedakah v'zeicha b'atem eidai v'ani Elohim. Lanu b'shes apanim b'chafein Adonai b'sin kum asei lanu Elohim. Lanu tzedakah v'tam shehitam tanu katzam pichis. Bidvash, Lanu b'shes apanim b'yom migrav l'fanav solesh Hashem udvash. Adonai tzedakah b'chul kulman v'er v'amud anan. Lanu b'shes apanim b'lechem hakelokel havosein b'aleim ragnan. Adonai tzedakah b'midbar l'pasar davar. Lanu b'shes apanim b'niatzos l'ban v'chazeros v'didah k'mduba. Adonai tzedakah b'sichal ha'og v'chal manachos ta'an. Lanu b'shes apanim b'achron Hashem ha'al v'cherem b'liv v'tzor ma'an. Adonai tzedakah b'al Hashem b'alta b'arba z'amoshim. Lanu b'shes apanim b'tzelem micha ki bo anachnu poshim. Adonai tzedakah b'kimat shilo b'noi givon v'beis olamim. Lanu b'shes apanim b'yersha shnim tzavonu v'vam anu nechlamim. Adonai tzedakah b'shnei korbanos shecharvu b'tzeinu v'anachnu kayamin. Lanu b'shes apanim b'shuveinu elecha v'chol leiv shetachshav eleinu b'rachamim. Adonai tzedakah b'tisham me'oz shana shehaysa sina k'busha min hishamat. Lanu b'shes apanim k'sava eish chamudos hatei Elohai aznacha shema.
We continue in a few moments. We'll continue with the Kinot on page 125 in the Rosenfeld, page 415 in the Koren, and page 248. And this Kinot, Zayal Vanon, represents a significant shift now in the Kinot. All the Kinot that we've seen till now have been very much focused on the Churban Habayit, the destruction of Yerushalayim, the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, and we're now shifting to realizing that Tisha B'Av is not just about commemorating the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, but it's a day when we commemorate all the destructions of, or all the tragedies that have befallen Jewish people throughout the course of history. Of course, Arzei Halavanon, which is about the 10 martyrs, is very much linked in with the Churban Habayit, but it's got other themes as well. It's linked in with the Churban Habayit because these were the 10 rabbinic leaders of Am Yisrael who were martyred after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. The Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, but still Jewish people were allowed to learn and study and teach Torah. Then subsequently, the Romans realized that the Jewish people were still alive. They thought, Rav Soloveitchik explained in his discourses on Kinot, he explained that the Romans thought, get rid of the Beit HaMikdash and you'll very quickly get rid of the Jewish people. Jewish people without the Beit HaMikdash is nothing. We can see 2,000 years later that, of course, it's not true. Jewish people without the Beit HaMikdash is like a crown without its jewels, but the crown is still there. The people still exist. And the reason why we still exist is because of the Torah. What the Romans wanted to do was they wanted to eradicate Torah, and therefore these events, presented usually in the Kinot as something that happened all on one day. It's not quite like that. It was spread over 2 or 3 generations, but in the 2 or 3 generations following the Churban HaBayit, what the Romans tried to do was to, now they'd eradicated the Beit HaMikdash, they now wanted to eradicate Torah as well. So over the course of the past couple of years, we've looked at various different of the Asara Harugei Malchut, the 10 rabbis who were martyrs. We've looked at Rabbi Chutzpit Turgeman and others. So today I want us to look at the first one to be killed, who was Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So if you look at I've given you some historical information about him. There were several Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. So this is Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel the first. If you look at that wonderful yichus, so this wasn't just somebody being killed, but this is Jewish royalty, as it were. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was a great grandson of Hillel. They say through his mother's side he was actually able to trace himself back to David HaMelech. So this really was royalty, not just in terms of his bloodline, but also in terms of his Torah line. So he was a great grandson of Hillel Hazaken. He was the son of Rabban Gamliel and the father of Rabban Gamliel, and the grandfather of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, his namesake, and he was the father-in-law of Rabbi Elazar ben Horkinus. So, this wasn't just, I don't know if there's any such thing as just somebody being killed. I think we regard every martyr as being somebody significant, but he was somebody particularly significant. So let's look at, just on page 11, we've got some pictures there of his burial place in the north of Israel. Bar Achna, I think is what it's called, and you can see it there in the north, which is of course where they all lived, where the Tanaim lived at this time in the north of Eretz Israel. Let's look at 3 accounts of his death. I want us first to look carefully at the account in the Kinot, and then to look at the account in Avot Rabbi Natan, and also in the Midrash Eila Eskara. So what does the account in the Kinot that we're going to read say? Yadu Goral mi Rishon Lacherev Burura. So they cast a lot to decide who was going to be chosen to be killed by the sword first. And when the lot fell on Rabbi Shimon, Pashat Savara Uvachad Kenigzerad Zera. He stuck out his neck and he cried about what was going to happen. The Rabbi Shimon Chazar Hasar Lahargo, and then the officer came to kill Rabbi Shimon. Benefesh Surah, translated here as with crafty design. Mizera Aharon Shal B'Vakasha Livchot Al Ben Hagvira. And then the descendant of Aaron was Rabbi Ishmael Kohen Gadol, who was the second one to be killed. When Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was killed, so Rabbi Ishmael, the Kohen Gadol, cried over this. Natal Rosho Netano al Arku Botav. And this is fascinating. He took the head of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, the severed head, put it on his knees and cried over it, Menorah HaTohorah, and called to Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel the Menorah HaTohorah. Menorah, of course, was the sign of Pilpul HaTorah. That's the Aron was the sign of Torah, but the Menorah was Pilpul HaTorah, the ability to delve into the details of Torah. And that is what Rabbi Ishmael Kohen Gadol was calling Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. And this is, of course, fascinating because Rabbi Kohen Gadol was the Kohen. How could he take the severed head of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel and put it on his knees? I don't know the answer to it. I sort of looked around a bit, and 1 or 2 people flagged this up as being most strange. but it's unclear why he was able to do this. Maybe he wasn't able to do this. Maybe he was just in such terrorized bereavement that's just what he did intuitively, impetuously, and didn't realize what had happened. The other possibility may be, from a halakhic perspective, I don't know if this is correct, but it could be, but if already they were in the same place when Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was killed, then there would be Tumat Ohel. So already Rabbi Elazar Kohen Gadol would have been Tamei with Tumat Mate. Maybe he followed the view that once he was already Tamei with Tumat Mate, then if he extended that wouldn't matter. And generally, though, we say that a Kohen, if he's in an Ohel with a mate, has to run out as quickly as possible, not even getting dressed. So it's very strange how he did this. It most likely it's just that he was so traumatized by what had happened that this is what he instinctively did. He placed his eyes on the eyes of the dead Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, piv al piv, and put his mouth on his mouth. Anava Amari answered and said out loud, Torah. This was the mouth that once spoke Torah, and now look at what's happened to it. And then straight after that, Rabbi Shmuel Kohen Gadol himself was put to death. So that's the fairly brief account that we have in Eicha Eskara. Interestingly, in Gemara, there's no account of Natan. Post-Talmudic minor tractate is linked some way with Massacres Avot, and quotes the line from Massacres Avot, Cherpa l'olam alinui hadin v'alivut hadin v'mipnei hamorim b'torah she'lo k'halacha, says, or paraphrases, it says, why does the sword come and attack people? Al inui hadin, because we've delayed justice, al ivut hadin, and justice is perverted, because of people who teach Torah not in the right way. So it's very interesting. This is used as the opening statement, because is this going to be saying something? Is this casting censure on Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel? If it is, it's very, very significant. Let's see. So when Rabbi Shimon Gamliel and Rabbi Ishmael were captured to be killed, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel was sitting there, and he couldn't understand what was going on. We're about to be executed as if we were common criminals. You know, how are people executed? They're executed for being Mechalel Shabbat. They're executed for practicing idolatry. They're executed for Gilui Arayot. They're executed for bloodshed. We haven't done any of these things. Why are we being executed in this same way? Amalo Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha. So Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha said to him, would you like me to tell you a bit of truth? Amar le emor, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says to him, yeah, tell me. Amar le, so Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha said to him, Shema Kshaita may say, I'm sitting at a meal, perhaps poor people came to your door, and you didn't allow them to come in and eat with you. I assume the implication is maybe you just gave them some money, gave them some vouchers, and sent them away instead of inviting them in to sit with you. Amarlo. So he said to him, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said to him, Hashamayim, by heaven, imasitike. I certainly never did this. I had gatekeepers at the door. I had a doorman. I did like Avraham Avinu did. I brought them in. I gave them food. I gave them the opportunity to say Birkat Hamazon, to praise HaKadosh Baruch Hu. I was really good as far as this was concerned. Amar lei, so Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha said to him, Shema Kshayite Yosef Doris Bahar Abayit. Perhaps I can tell you what went wrong when you were darshaning the halakha on the Har HaBayit. So we see that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, was part of the Sanhedrin. We see this from the biographical information we've got at the beginning. Perhaps when everybody was sitting in front of you, you were a bit arrogant, a bit proud of yourself. Amarlo, Yishmael Achim Yuchan Adam Shekabel Gao. He said, Yishmael, my brother. So I'm not sure if this is supposed to be read rhetorically or not. Maybe I need to be ready to accept my deficiency, and maybe this is true. Maybe this is why I'm going to the sword. So this is also an interesting episode for lots of reasons. Who would have thought that a person is being taken out to be executed? He's saying, "What have I done to deserve this?" And somebody comes up to him and says to him, "Well, I've got a few suggestions I could make. So perhaps it was this." And when he says, "No, it wasn't this," okay, well, that's good. We can cross that one off the list. But maybe it was that one. And he goes through the things that he might have done wrong. Usually, I think when a person is facing that sort of situation, the response that we would give is, "Don't worry, you're a good person. This is a terrible travesty." Instead, he's presumably trying to help him do teshuva. So it wasn't as if Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said to him, "Be quiet, leave me alone, I wasn't asking you." So he didn't get annoyed with him. He said, "No, I didn't do this." And then the next time when something else was suggested, he said, "Taki, you might be right. Maybe this is what I did." And it's just sort of interesting the self-honesty that these sages had, that they were willing to face the sword and to face the reality of why they would be being taken to the sword. And it was suggested, to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, that why was he dying? He was dying because Zachadat Chalecha. He was too arrogant when he was teaching Torah. Of course, this is a cautionary tale to all of us who teach Torah. From my own experience, unfortunately, it's very easy to be excited and to think that you're good and that everybody wants to listen to you and that you're the bee's knees. And we see from this how dangerous that is. So they were begging the executioner. So Rabbi Ishmael Kohen Gadol was saying, "Listen, I'm a Kohen Gadol, the son of a Kohen Gadol. You should let me be killed first so that I don't have to see my colleague be put to death." And Rabbi Shimon Gamliel said, "No, Ani Nasi ben Nasi. I'm a Nasi, the son of the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin. My father was the head of the Sanhedrin. Hargeni Techila, kill me first. And don't let me see the death of my colleague." Amar lahem hapilu goralot. So the executioner said, "You know what? Cast lots," which of course in Eila Eskara we've seen, happened already. They cast the Eila Eskara. The lots were cast by the Roman authorities. Here, the lots are being cast by the martyrs themselves. I don't know what the significance is of lots in this, but it might be worth considering. Is there a theme here? The significance of the casting of lots. So they cast lots, and the lot fell on Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Immediately the executioner took the sword. Rabbi Ishmael ben Elisha, so here it's Rabbi Elisha who took it. It wasn't Rabbi Ishmael Kohen Gadol. This seems to be somebody else. Rabbi Elisha took it, which of course saves our problem. I think saves our problem of a Kohen taking it. unless Rabbi Elisha was also identified as
Rabbi
Kohen.
Yishmael ben Eli.
That was Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, but I don't know if that's Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol, so I don't know if it's the same person. In the said Kadosh ben Eman, Shemotzi San Pelonin Trovot Vavanim Trovot Magaliot. You always, the gems. You were speaking gems to us. Who has cast you down to the dust? And applied the pasuk to him from Zechariah, how he's been killed. So that's the avot to Rabbi Natan. Midrash Eila Eskara has it a little bit differently and says the first part is the same. Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol ben Rekav. Now back to it being Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol taking the head. Sarach alav b'mar nefesh v'amar ein Torah v'eis chara. So this is a different lament, but it's a lament that we find with we'll see in the Kinot. We'll see in a moment. We'll see that it's expressed by somebody else. Whereas woe for the Torah. What rewards is this for teaching Torah? The tongue that was once would explain Torah in 70 different languages and 70 different ways. Now it's licking the dust. And he was crying and mourning for Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Why is it that you, as an elder, that you're crying over your colleague? You shouldn't be crying over others. You should be crying about yourself because you're going to die. Alei Rabbi Yishmael, I'm crying for myself in actual fact. Because my colleague was greater than me. So I never reached this. I'm crying for the fact that there was somebody greater than me in Torah. And that he got ahead of me in the line to the Shiva Shalmala. That's why I am crying. So we see from Avot Rabbi Natan, the Midrash Eila Eskara, we see additional aspects and dimensions to what we've got here in the Kinot about what's happened. The notion that they fought, as it were, Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, as to who was going to die first. Why did they want to die first? Because they didn't want to see the tragedy of the other one being killed. And that, of course, is a very moving notion. And then also the response of Rabbi Yishmael Kohen Gadol after he saw his colleague being killed. So we're going to continue now with the Kinot of Arzei Halavanon, which is on page 125 in the Rosenfeld, 415 in the Koran, and 248 in the Art Scroll. Arzei Levanon Adirai HaTorah Balei Treisin B'Mishnah V'Gmara Giborei Cholach Hamalei HaBetara Damam Nishpach Min HaShita Gvura Hinam Kedoshei Harugei Malchut HaSara V'Aleila Nivokia Veini Nigara Zochri Ezat B'Mara Chemdat Yisrael Klei HaKodesh Nezer V'Atara Torei Lei Kedoshim Meitu B'Mitah Chamura Yadu Gora Al Mi Rishon HaCheref Berura Kinfol Gora Al Rabban Shimon Pashat Savarol B'Chad Kinigzran Zeira the Rabban Shimon Chazar Hasar Lahargo B'Nefesh Nitzura Mizera Aharon Shal B'Vakasha Livkot Al Ben Hagvira Natal Roshon Tanol Al Kubutav Menorah HaTorah Sameina Valena Avupapif Ahava Gemura Anabamar המתגבר בתורה. פתאום נכנסה עליו מיתה משונה וחמורה, ציווה להפשיט את ראשו בתר הסחירה. ים באורו אמרו לנפשך שכי ונעבורה, רשע פושט עת הגיע לנקום תפילין מצוות פרה. צעקה ונזדעזע העולם בארץ פורה. מאחריו הביאו את רבי עקיבא, עוקר הרים מתוך ענן זו בזו בסברה, וסרקו בשרו במסרק ברזל להשתברה. יצאתה נשמתו באחד, ובת קול אמרה, אשריך רבי עקיבא גופך טהור בכל מיני טהרה. בן בבא רבי יהודה אחריו הביאו, בשברון לוי אזהרה, נהרג בן 70 שנה בידי ארורה. יושב בתענית היה נגיד חסיד במלאכתו למהרה. רבי חנניה בן תרדיון אחריו מקל קהילות ציון שרה. יושב דורש ספר תורה עמו, והקיפו בחבילי זמורה. את האור הציתו בהם ופרחו בספר תורה. ספוגים של צמר הניחו על ליבו, שלא ימות מהרה. חסיד רבי ישבב הסופר הרגוהו הממורה, זרקו והשליכו לכלבים, ולא הוקפא בקבורה. יצתה בת קול עליו, שלא הניח כלום, מתורת משה לשמרה. ואחריו רבי חוצפית ביום עברה, אף הפורח נשרף בעל פיו כבמדורה. צדיק רבי אלעזר בן שמוע באחרונה, נהרג במדקרה. יום ערב שבת היה, זמן קידוש ויקדש ויקרא, חרב שלפו עליו ולא יניחו בחיים לגמרי. יצתה נשמתו ברא אלוקים, יוצר וצר צורה. כהנה וכהנה הוסיפו בני עוולה לאנוס פיגרה, בסקילה שריפה, הרג וחנק, מי יוכל לשרה נותרת ממנה, יאכלו אריות ספסורה. חזי התנופה בשוק התרומה תפו אריה והכפירה, ייטיב אדוני ולא יוסיף עוד ויסרה. אמץ ברכיים כושלות חלק יעקב ומושיע בעת צרה, לצדק ימלוך מלך יאמר שלמו ימי אבלך, לא רע נישא בנילך. And we continue now on page 144 in the Rosenfeld, page 515 in the Koren, page 304 in the Art Scroll. And again, we have one of these compare and contrast Kinot. In this Kinot, we're comparing the glory when the Jewish people left Mitzrayim with the sense of destruction and desolation we experienced when we were exiled from Yerushalayim. But of course, when we get to the very end, the final lines will look forward to the return to Yerushalayim. B'mheira v'yameinu. We'll sing this Kinah together. Ishtuk adekebe baloti alibi betzeiti mimitzrayim kinim ha'ira lamanaskira betzeiti mirushalayim. אז ישיב משה שלא ינשא בצאתי ממצרים, ויקונן ירמיה בן הנהיליה בצאתי מירושלים. ביתי התכונן ושכן הענן בצאתי ממצרים, וחמת אל שכנה עלי כענן בצאתי מירושלים. גלה ימנו וחלום הקמו בצאתי ממצרים, שגונים שטפו והראש יצפו בצאתי מירושלים. V'gan shamayim, v'soya somayim, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, la'naman tamarim, v'mayim hamarim, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, hashkei v'haaretz, v'lim v'havarei, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, korei v'haaretz, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, v'mareka v'odonai, v'yishem v'adonai, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, v'kerem v'tusha, v'zeh v'tusha, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, v'zebach v'mincha, v'shemen ha'mishcha, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Karkim v'shabazot, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Tamid v'level, v'tov v'hevel, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Tov v'ohalim, na'avat v'yolim, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Olei Yishmaelim, Machanos Harelim, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Yofer v'shmita, v'eretz shoketa, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Machul v'tzizuz, v'aros v'rizuz, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Kapores v'arod, v'alei Tzion, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Yavnei ha'kera, v'nei ha'kera, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, v'lidim v'arodim, v'shivim v'yedim, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, v'orim v'kodim, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Moshe Yireinu, v'tzeitim v'netzah, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, v'na'aman v'nashama, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, v'chamimenu v'hinei einenu, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Sitrei Marohet, v'sitrei Marehet, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Olos Uzvakim, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, v'perem v'urim, v'nei Tzion ha'yikarim, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, v'arei mikba'ot, v'chavot mikba'ot, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, v'rikot azruot, v'konot azruot, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Tzazahah, v'havshem v'raha, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, u'shmach Alei Tzion, v'havas ha'ezer, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, v'sham v'lav, v'vaytem v'hira, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, v'yalav v'vara, v'ruach ha'tzuma, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, v'yav Yeshua, v'chashos ha'torah, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, v'na'akas lo'ilad, v'na'akas ha'ala, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Shulchan Torah, v'chalil Torah, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, v'lil v'so'eva, v'sel u'matzeva, v'tzeitim Yerushalayim, Torah, v'tzeitim Mitzrayim, Sasol v'simcha, v'nasher v'manacha, And now again we move themes, as it were, in the Kinnot, and we move to a series of Kinot known as the Tzionim, or as they say in English, the Zionites, primarily of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, one of the great medieval poets. Till now we've been bewailing the Korban Habayit. We've been talking about how Yerushalayim has been destroyed. We've been conjuring up images of destruction, and that's one way of remembering the Korban Habayit. But the other way of remembering the Korban Habayit is to talk about not how it was destroyed, but to think about what we're lacking and what we're missing, and to think about Yerushalayim b'yofya, talk about Yerushalayim in its glory and how it was once upon a time so wonderful. And what I want to do before we remind us of these is to look at some things to do with Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. I've got things a bit order here in the contrast. 22, we've got a little bit of biographical details about the Halevi, born in 1075 and died in 1140. He was a contemporary, probably, of the Ezra. He was born in either Toledo, and he lived most of his life in Spain. Towards the end, went to Eretz Yisrael because Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael was a key theme of his aspirations. On page 23, we've got about his plan to go to Eretz Yisrael. Halevi's decision to emigrate to Eretz Yisrael, a gradual one, reflected the highest aspiration of his life. It resulted from a complex of circumstances, intense and realistic and political, disillusion with the pure Jewish existence in the diaspora, intense longing for a positive redeeming act, and come in the year 4890, 1130. And of course, these are all themes which have been repeated in perhaps in the course of the past 150 years, with the only place where prophecy is possible, and Hebrew, the language of Israel. From this it is clearly followed that the ideal existence for the Jews was attainable only in their own land. Throughout the philosophical and poetic work of Judah Halevi, as in his life, one can sense the intellectual effort to make other Jews conscious of this. In his philosophical work, as well as in his poetry, Judah Halevi spoke out harshly against those who deceived themselves by speaking of Zion and by praying for its redemption, while their hearts were close to it and their actions far removed from it. Essentially, armchair Zionism. Talk about it, but we don't go. Judah, however, understood the problems which emigration to Israel posed for many people. He decided to realize his own aliyah, the educational act of an individual who also seeks personal redemption. Great difficulties lay before him. The long journey by both sea and desert was perilous. He knew that he would encounter very difficult living conditions in Eretz Yisrael, which was under Crusader rule at that time. Moreover, Judah Halevi had to counter the arguments of his friends who tried to sort of thing. My great-grandparents went on Aliyah from Ireland in 1922. They went to massacre, which was one of the first Rothschild settlements. And I don't know what their life was like in Ireland before they went, but certainly they were very, very poor in Eretz Israel. It was a very, very difficult existence for them, and they were giving up relative comfort, I guess, in Europe to get to Eretz Israel. It was so difficult. In 1934, they sent my grandfather back to the UK, back to Great Britain, because it was so difficult for them in Eretz Israel. He studied a little deeply with his intimate attachment to Spain, the land of his father's graves. At one time, he even looked upon Spain with pride and thankfulness as a homeland for the Jews. So these are things which we're re-experiencing in our own lives. These indecisions which occupied him in the last period of his life find expression in his poems of Zion, in the Kuzari and in the Genisa letters which date from the same period. On the other hand, Yehuda Halevi was encouraged to make the journey by his friend Chalfon Halevi, who he met in Spain in 1139. On the 24th of Elul, September 8th, 1140, Yehuda Halevi, accompanied by Isaac, the son of Abraham ibn Esher, among others, arrived in Alexandria. And he goes on to say he spent time in Alexandria, and then he went to Eretz Israel. So the question whether or not he really reached Eretz Israel, everybody knows the story about Yehuda Halevi. As soon as he reached Eretz Israel, he kneeled down to kiss the ground, and an Arab horseman rode over him and killed him. That would be true, of course, if he'd ever reached Eretz Israel, but that's not necessarily true, because finally, however, Yehuda Halevi boarded a ship at Alexandria bound for Eretz Israel, but its departure was delayed by inclement weather. From the elegies written in Egypt and from the Genisa letters which mention his death, it could be concluded that he died about 6 months after reaching Egypt, and that he was also buried there. So there's the romantic account and perhaps the true account. What denied him in life, however, the famous legend first mentioned in Shosheret HaKabbalah, later by Heinrich Heine, his Hebron Meloidim, has applied. It makes that he managed the city of Jerusalem, but as he kissed its stone, a passing Arab horseman, Jerusalem back then was under the Crusaders, trampled on him just as he was reciting his elegy, Tzion Halor Tishali. So it wasn't an Arab horseman, it wasn't in Yerushalayim, he wasn't saying Tzion Halor Tishali, but otherwise it's all true. But the point is that he was certainly denied the pleasure of living in Eretz Israel, but he tried to move and emigrate to Eretz Israel. And then we've got a note here about the various types of poems that he wrote, particularly his poems about Eretz Israel. Before we look at the Kinot, I want to just flag up one of his very famous short poems, Libi B'Mizrach. It's on page 26. I think Yaakov Shweki has put this to music, if I'm not mistaken. But I've got a few different translations of it here in English, but it's a very powerful poem, which I think reflects some of the emotions that we feel when we think about moving to Eretz Israel. Libi b'Mizrach, v'ani b'chsof ma'arav. It's a very famous expression of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. I am in the east, but my heart is b'sof ma'arav. Sorry, Libi b'Mizrach. My heart is in the east, v'anochi b'sof ma'arav. But I am at the far end of the west. So expressing how his emotional energy is in Israel, but his physical self is in Europe. So how can I eat what food I got, and how can it be pleasant to me when I realize that I'm in the wrong place? Eicha ashalem zarai ve'esarai v'od chevel edom v'ani b'chevel arab. How can I fulfill my nadarim, all the oaths that I took that I should be bringing persecution, Bani b'chevel Arab, and I'm under restraints of Islam. Yakel ba'inai azov kol tuv Sfarad. He says, I would very happily leave all the goodness of Sfarad behind. And I would be equally happy to exchange it with the dirt of the ground in where the holy Beit HaMikdash has been destroyed. That's what he's saying. He's about the pleasures of Spain. He lived a luxurious, comfortable existence, and he's saying that he would gladly replace it. So let's look at Tzion Halot Tishali, and I've marked it up in the packet on page 2728, because every year we come to Tzion Halot Tishali. Let's explain the Kinot. Says, this is one of the most famous Kinot by Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, and then we don't look at it carefully to get a proper appreciation of what it's talking about. And I've highlighted a number of lines that I think are worth us considering. So let's look at the first line. Tzion halot tishali l'shlom asirayich. Tzion, won't you ask of the well-being of your captive sons? Dorshei shlomeich, they inquire about your welfare. And they are the remainder of your flock. I think this line is very important in terms of summing up the relationship between the Jews of Eretz Israel and the Jews of Galut. It's a complex relationship that we have here. That Tzion halot tishali l'shlom asirayich. So Eretz Israel, I would say Medinat Israel, should be concerned about what's going on in the Golah. And likewise, the Jews of the Golah, Dorshei Shlomeich, our role, one of our roles as Jews in the diaspora, is to be concerned about the welfare of Dorshei Shlomeich. We need to seek. It's not just asking about the welfare of Eretz Israel. Here in the Rosenfeld is translated as inquire after your welfare, but I think it might mean more than that. Dorshei Shlomeich, or at least we can interpret it to mean more than that. Dorshei Shlomeich, we should be actively seeking the welfare of Eretz Israel and the Jews of Eretz Israel and Medinat Israel. There are certain things which Israeli Jewry can do for diaspora Jewry, and there are certain things which diaspora Jewry can do for Israel Jewry. And we've all got responsibilities to each other as we go through our lives. Then goes on to say, Livkot enutech anitanim, when I bewail humiliations, I'm like a jackal. V'eitech elom shivat shvuteich, ani chinor l'shirayich. But when I dream of the return of your captivity, I'm like a harp for your songs. I picked out this line, of course, because it's the basis of Naomi Shemer's Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, one of my favorite tunes. I think it's got a lot of spirituality to it, but this Anichi Nor L'Shirayich, taken straight from Rabbi Yehuda Halevi. Libi libi leveit el, v'lifniel ma'od ye'emer u'lemachanayim, v'chol pigei tohorayich. My heart longs greatly for Beit El, for Peniel, and for Machanayim, and all the meeting places of your pure ones. Interesting to note the places that the Paitan is singling out as places that he wants to go to. He hasn't mentioned Yerushalayim specifically. The Makom HaMikdash is identified here as Beit El, which is of course where Yaakov had his dream, and he said, "Ezekim Beit Elokim V'zeh Shar HaShamayim." So he identified this as being the gateway to heaven, and the place where the Beit HaMikdash was going to be in the future. There's all that difficulty of understanding if it was Beit El, was it Yerushalayim, and Hakadosh Baruch Hu folded up the land, etc. But what is it that Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is really aspiring for here? What's the common denominator between these places? These are all places of revelation, and that's what he's hankering for in Eretz Israel. He's not necessarily hankering after holy sites, but he's hankering after sites of revelation, and I think that's very significant. Then he goes on to say, At Beit Melucha, you are the royal house, Va'at Kisei Adonai, and you are the throne of Hashem, So how have servants come to sit on the thrones of your noble ones? This is the what Yerushalayim is. Yerushalayim is Beit Nucha. It's a palace. It's a divine palace, and it's a palace for the Shekhinah. And this is the pain that we should feel when Avadim are sitting on the throne. And I certainly don't want to get into politics today, but the Makom HaMikdash and the fact that it's Avadim who are there. It's not, it might Rishmi, it might legally be under Jewish control, but it's not in practical sense is under Jewish control. I don't have a strong view that Jews should go up onto Har HaBayit and pray on Har HaBayit and all these things. Even if we're not going up onto Har HaBayit, we should feel pained at the fact that others are on Har HaBayit and that the Mora HaMikdash is not being observed in the way that it should be. Islam is a monotheistic religion. It's not like building a church on Har HaBayit. And there were times in Jewish history, the times of the Crusaders, they managed to build a church on Har HaBayit. That's the Avodah Zarah going on to Har HaBayit. Islam isn't Avodah Zarah, but it's still not worship on Har HaBayit as it should be. This is something which should pain us. Point number 5 here is a theme which is important to Rabbi Yehuda Halevi and the Kuzari. Chayei neshamot avir artzei umimor dror avkat afareich. What does he say here? The air of your land is the very life of your souls. The Gemara talks about the air of the Eretz Israel is machkin. It grants people wisdom. And this is a theme which Rabbi Yehuda Halevi developed, the theme that just being in Eretz Israel, the air of Eretz Israel is spiritually enriching. Just go to Eretz Israel and breathe in the air. That's something which is very special and enriching. Yinam l'nafshi haloch harom yachet alei charavot shmama asher hayu d'virayich. A rare delight were it for my soul to walk about naked and barefoot in the utterly desolate place where once stood your mercy seat. So again, this notion of we'd be willing to walk about Yachet barefoot in the dust of Eretz Israel. It's better the Kuzari is establishing the notion it would be better to be in Eretz Israel amongst the dust than comfortably in Chutz La'aretz. And in number 7, we talk about Sion, Kalilat Yofi, Sion, perfection of beauty. And that is, I don't think it's just a romanticized idea. Maybe it is a romanticized idea. It's sort of an interesting notion. So many of us, I'm sure, have had that experience. We go to Israel, wherever you're staying, you're staying in Yerushalayim, maybe you've got an apartment there, maybe you're in a hotel. The first morning, if it's a sunny day, you come outside, you look outside, it's beautiful. Yerushalayim is beautiful. I don't know, is it objective as it being beautiful? Is it, as a tourist who comes to London and has a hotel in the centre of London, looks out, do they feel that same sort of lift of the spirit? I think we all know that. You step outside, it's beautiful. If it's, rainy in Yerushalayim in December, it's pretty miserable. But, on a summer's day, you look out, the Judean hills, the cranes everywhere disrupting the landscape. They're beautiful cranes, not the birds. The building. You see, Yerushalayim is being built, and you can see into the distance. Just more and more of Yerushalayim. Look towards the old city. Kalilat. Certain things in in life that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Take an elderly man of 80 and his elderly wife of 80. He turns to her and he says, you look beautiful. Objectively, she looks wrinkled. She's not going to win a Miss World competition. I don't want to be, ageist or anything like that. No, but her husband of 60 years, she's the most beautiful person in the world. And that's how we feel about Yerushalayim. I just don't know. If I was in Yerushalayim today, I'd look out, my parents' flat, beautiful view, till they built something right in front of the window, another building in front of it. Even that's beautiful, seeing there are other Jews, living there in Yerushalayim. But you still got, if you look between the gap between the buildings, you can see beautifully. It looks wonderful. You get that, why aren't I living here? I don't know if I took somebody from a non-Jewish person who doesn't have an appreciation of Yerushalayim. It looks nice. Would they feel that same lift that we lift? And I'm sure you can all identify with what I'm saying. That is, Tzion Kalilat Yofi. That is something so wonderful. And that's what Rabbi Yehuda Halevi is describing. We rush through this Kinot every year. We say, it's one of the most important Kinot. But it's telling us how beautiful Yerushalayim is and making us feel, what are we doing here? Number 8. Yishne v'yachalof kalil kol mamlachot ha'ilil chosneich Yerushalayim. May all the kingdoms of idolatry be changed and utterly pass away, but your power is forever. And I think this is again a utterly true statement. We look at how many nations have ruled over Yerushalayim. So many nations have ruled over Yerushalayim. They've all gone. Is there any Byzantine kingdom left? Are there any Moors left? Christendom, is it what it once was? What they call the Holy Roman Empire. There's the Vatican. But Rome doesn't rule the world. What still exists? Israel still exists, and that that is an eternal truth. Happy is he that waits and will succeed in witnessing the rising of your light, when over him shall break forth your dawn. Happy is the man who makes his choice and comes near to dwell in your court. Of course, this was the choice of Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, who chose to go and live in Eretz Israel. So that was the themes I wanted us to consider there in Tzion Tishali, and we'll read that Kinot on page 152 in the Rosenfeld, 555 in the Koran, and 328 in the Art Scroll. Adam will lead us in this Kinot.
Tzion Tishali, Lishlam Asirayich, Doshe Shlomech, Veheim Yete Adorayich, Miyam Imizrach Imitzafon V'Teiman, Shalom Rachok V'Karot, Se'i Mikol Avarayich, Ushalom Asir, Tigva Notein Dema'av, Ketal Echemon, V'Nichsaf Levidatam Al Hadav Havarayich, Ivkos Enuteich Anitanin, Ve'et Echelom, Sivat Shveteich Anichino, V'Shirayich, Libi Leveit El, Lifniel Ma'od, Yehema Ulamachanayi V'chol, Higei Tohovayich, Sham HaShechina, Shechina Lach, V'Hayotzreich, Patach Lemul Sha'arei Shachat, Sha'avayich, Ukavor Adonai Levat Hayam Oreich, Ve'ei Shemesh V'Sahar V'Chochavim Me'irayich, Emcha L'Nafshi L'Hishkapeich, V'Makom Asher Ruach Elohim Shefucha Al V'Chirayich, At Beit Mulucha, V'At Kisei Adonai, Ve'eit Yeshivu Avodim, Alei Tzion Kivirayich, Mi Yitneni Mushotet, V'Mekomot Asher Niglu Elohim Lochazayich, V'Tzirayich, Miyaseli Nafayim Bachik Nodot Anid Lebitray Lebevi Bain Bitawayich Epol Laapai Alei Atseich Ve'etze Abanayich Mood Vachonein Et Afavayich Ach Ki Omdi Alei Kivot Avotai Ve'eshtomein Behebron Alei Mivcha Kevavayich Evo V'yarech V'hamilech Ve'emod Bini V'giladeich Ve'eshtomein Ma Al Ha'abavayich Ha'abavim V'hu Ha Asher Sham Shnei Urim Gedolim Mi'irayich U'movayich Chayei Neshamot Ave Atseich Umimadoro Avkat Afaveich V'nofetzuf Nahavayich Yinam Lenafshi Haloch Avom V'yachei Alei Chavot Shemama Asher Hayu Dibirayich Bimkom Aruneich Asher Nignaz Ubimkom Kuruvayich Asher Shachnu Chadavei Chadarayich Algoz V'ashlich Ve'eh Nizri Ve'ekov Zaman Chilel Be'eretz Temeya Et Nizirayich Eich Yeravli Achol Ushdot Ve'et Echezeh Ki Yizchavu Haklavim Et Kibirayich Oy Eich Mo O Yom Yi Matoch Le'enai V'od Ereh Ve'bi Ovim Pigrei Nisharayich Kos Hayagonim La'at Hapi Ma'at Ki Chava Maluchas Alai V'nafshi Mim Rovayich Et Eskava Ahala Eshte Chamarech Ve'esko Oholiva Ve'emse Et Shemavayich Tzion Kilat Yofi Avat V'chein Tikshiri Meyaz Uvach Nikshuru Nashot Chavevayich Heim Hasameichem L'Shalvateich V'Koavim Al Shomamuteich V'Uvochim Al Shabavayich V'Bo Shevi Shoafim Neikeich V'Mishtachavim Ish Mimkomo Elei Nochach Sha'avayich Edrei Hamoneich Asher Galu V'Hit Chazru Meha L'Giva V'Lo Shachachu Gidei Rayich Hamachazik V'Shulayich Umit Amsim La'alot V'Le'achos V'San Sanei Temarayich Shina U'Patros Hayachuch V'Godolam V'Im Heblam Yedamu L'Tumayich V'Urayich El Mi Yedamu Mishichayich Ve'el Mi Niviyayich Ve'el Mi Leviyayich V'Shavayich Yishne V'Yachalov Ke'el Kol Mamlachos Ha'elil Chosneich L'Olam V'Do V'Do Nizavayich Yivech L'Moshav Elohayich V'Ashrei Enosh Yivcha V'Yikva V'Yishkon V'Chatze Vayich Ashrei Mechakeh V'Yakia V'Yiveh Alot Orech V'Yibaku Alav Shechavayich V'Vot B'Tovot B'Chirayich V'La'alot B'Simchateich V'Shuvei Chelei Kadmat V'Lovayich.
A further theme in the Kinot, as we sort of touched on when we introduced the Kinot of Eicha Ezkara, of Asura, the Azay Banon, is the theme that there are other tragedies that have befallen Am Yisrael over the course of history, and a number of the Kinot deal with things to do with the Crusades, things to do with, as we've discussed on a previous occasion, the Kinot Shali Srufa Va'esh, which describes the burning of the Talmud in the streets of France. There are Kinnot that don't appear in our text, but which appear in other rites. We discussed a couple of years ago about Gerush Sfarad, the expulsion from Spain, and we looked at Kinnot that exist in some of the Sephardi rites which address them. And each year I like us to look at another event in the course of Jewish history, which looks at the destruction of Jewish communities over the course of time, Tisha B'Av being commemorative not only of the Churban HaBayit, but of all tragedies that have befallen Am Yisrael. And what I want us to spend a little bit of time today looking at is the 1929 Hebron massacre, which took place in August 29. So not far off 100 years ago, just over 92 years ago. And it's probably something that many people have heard about, but it's not necessarily something that we actually know a lot about. Hebron Yeshiva is in Yerushalayim, and the question always is, we understand why the Mir Yeshiva is in Yerushalayim and such yeshivot, but why is Hebron in Yerushalayim? Why isn't Hebron in Hebron? The answer is that Hebron was in Hebron until 1929, when it was driven out, and it re-established itself in Yerushalayim, first in Mea Sharim, and then latterly in Givat Mordechai, which is where the main Hebron campus is today. But it was also, prior to that, although there's still a branch in Mea Sharim. But the Hebron Yeshiva was originally a branch of Slobodka. It was part of Slobodka Yeshiva. And Slobodka was a very important yeshiva in Europe back in the day. There were two branches of the Muslim movement. There was Novardok and Slobodka. So Novardok, they believed in Shiflut HaAdam. They believed in the way that you train a person to improve their midot was by making them feel worthless. The person is worth nothing. They say that one of the things they used to do in Novardok was, they'd send a person to go to the post office and ask for a bag of nails, so that the person behind the counter would laugh at them and scorn them and make them feel stupid. And that was a good way of improving your midot, that you should feel stupid. And that in Novardok, everybody had a responsibility, to do something for the yeshiva. If you were a new bocher, you'd be allowed to go to the post office once a week to buy the stamps for the office. I guess on that occasion you were allowed to ask for stamps, not for nails. To clean the floors of the Beis HaMedrash, you had to wait till you were an advanced bocher. That was a privilege. The advanced bochers, that they could clean the floors. That was Novardok. On the other hand, there was Slobodka. Slobodka believed that the way of improving your midot was by impressing upon you Gadlus HaAdam, that human beings have great dignity and that we have to behave in a way that reflects our dignity, and that is the best way of dealing with our midot. If you look on page 17, got a brilliant picture here of them, the Yeshiva Bochrim, outside the Yeshiva in Hebron in the 1920s. You think of how does the Yeshiva Bocher dress today? Any self-respecting Yeshiva Bocher, if you are not wearing black jacket, black trousers, white shirt, and a black hat, you're not serious. If you went to Yeshiva in Yerushalayim today dressed in a straw bow tie, and a white jacket like that, you'd be laughed out of the place. But in Slobodka, that's how the Bochrim dressed. And you see pictures they used to take every year for fundraising purposes. A picture of the whole yeshiva, and the Rosh Yeshiva and everything. The Rosh Yeshiva didn't actually dress like this. The Rosh Yeshiva dressed differently. But the Bochrim all dress like they're all clean shaven, and they all, dressed really naturally, the latest trends and fashions like that, not because they were obsessed with fashion, but because they believed in gadlus ha'adam, and that learning Torah is a profession, an occupation to be proud of, and you don't dress like a shloch, you dress like you're going into the office or somewhere important. That's what Hebron was, and that is what was destroyed as well. It was, we've got images in our minds of the old Yishuv, and absolute poverty and covered in dust and everything. They were very poor in Hebron Yeshiva. But they certainly dressed with dignity, and that was what was destroyed. I said you've got these pictures of the yeshivot, where everything was all the bottom. You see all of them, with their bow ties on and their boater hats, and that's the gadlus ha'adam of Hebron, which was destroyed. So let's read a little bit about what happened in Hebron, certainly for Tisha B'Av afternoon. So we're not going to go through the whole of this. This is taken from Jewish Action, the OU's magazine, summer 2019. But certainly if you're looking for something appropriate to read this afternoon, then you can finish off this packet and you can read about this. Let's just read about what happened to Rabbi Moshe Gold at his experiences. It was on that Shabbat, the end of August 1929. And we should note, we're going to see that prior to that time, the relationship between the Jews and the Arabs in Hebron was reasonably good. So they had good relations. They didn't really have much space in the yeshiva dorms, and the yeshiva bochrim would rent rooms in Arab homes. So you couldn't imagine doing that today in Hebron. So no Jew would live with an Arab; they'd be frightened for their lives. But in those days, there was quite good relationships. People knew each other quite well. We're going to see, and yet it all turned sour. And this is one of the things that has been very worrying in the latest rounds of violence in Eretz Israel. There's been lots of talk about. It's been a very long time since there were serious disturbances, from Israeli Arabs, in places like Lod and Yaffo. Now, there's always been a bit of tension, but essentially the two populations have got on quite well together. This is one of the things that's been very worrying. The latest round of violence is that people who lived together for so long in relative harmony, that's gone wrong. Of course, this is a repeated motif throughout the course of Jewish history. We all know of stories from the Shoah of people who lived, families lived in the same roads, for generations in Germany with their German neighbours, and all of a sudden, overnight, friend turned to foe. And that's what's happened in Hebron. So let's see this account. All night long, bloodthirsty Arabs ran through the streets in search of Jewish victims. My father and his roommates barricaded the doors and windows of the home in which they lived. At dawn, things seemed to quieten down. My father wanted very much to check on his Rebbe, Reb Moshe Mordechai Epstein, and daven with him. Although the Bachrim didn't hear anything going on in the streets, they were afraid that this was a ploy, and they warned my father not to go outside. My father, however, insisted on checking on his Rebbe and left the house. As it turned out, all the boys in the house where my father had been hiding were slaughtered. When an Arab attacked a Rebbe, a young Bocher threw himself onto his Rebbe, crying out, "You gave me life." The young man was killed while saving his Rebbe's life. My father reached the Rosh Yeshiva's house. The Arabs pounded the door of Rabbi Epstein's home with a battering ram. When the battering ram broke through the door, it hit him in the face and knocked out one of his teeth. As this was happening, the British chief of police of Hebron rode past them down the block. The rioters quickly dispersed. The yeshiva boys pleaded with him on Friday afternoon to prevent the probable violence. However, he did nothing to stop it. The police chief's wife even knew Rabbi Epstein. Prior to the massacre, the Jews had very good relations with the Arabs in the area, and the yeshiva made sure everyone got along. And Yehuda Shlonim, one of the leaders of the Hebron Jewish community, was close friends with the local Arabs. Nevertheless, the Arabs slaughtered his entire family. Only his toddler son Shlomo survived. There's a picture somewhere of that in the package. That's a picture of an aunt and the baby. At some point, my father was wounded. His body was thrown together with a pile of corpses. Later, a reporter trying to identify the murdered boys searched their pockets for identification. Came across my father's name and recorded it on the list of the murdered. My grandfather, who was traveling in Europe at the time, noticed someone reading his newspaper with a headline publicizing the terrible pogrom. He grabbed the newspaper and saw my father's name listed amongst the murdered. It was then that my grandfather suffered his first heart attack. Ultimately, he learned that my father had survived. But that's an account of what went on, in the barricading themselves into the house, absolutely terrified of what was going to happen. We turn to page 17, where the picture of the Bochrim is. Again, we've got another account of what's happened. That Shabbos morning, I walked from my lodgings to the Lazarowski home. Looking out of my window, I watched as carloads of Arab sheikhs traveled toward Ma'at HaMachpelah, heading for the large mosque there. We davened Shachrit in the Lazarowski home, too frightened to step outside. We read the Torah portion from the Chumash, as we did not have a Sefer Torah with us. By the time we reached Mustafa, everyone was terrified. We had the gut feeling something terrible was about to take place. There have been hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They spilled into the streets singing war songs. Mrs. Lazarowski joined us to sit down and eat the Shabbat meal. But before she had even finished her sentence, blood-curdling shouts pierced the air. Thousands of bloodthirsty Arabs began stampeding towards the Jewish homes. We heard banging and more screaming. Residents ran outside, hoping to find shelter in the municipality's nearby health clinic. Unfortunately, once outside, they met up with the raged masses. As they ran back to the house, they tried catching the attention of the policeman who stood nearby, but the policeman didn't move a muscle. Meanwhile, the rioters had filled the house. They pounced on the head of the family and killed him with their knives. From our post on the top floor, we heard loud banging on the front gate. Had our turn come, the fear was tangible. Every person in the house shook uncontrollably. With superhuman strength, I hoisted a long, heavy bed on my back and placed it on the space between the front door and the inner door steps, leading up to the second floor, where we were all hiding. The Arab rioters refused to give up. They headed to the house next door. The Arab landlord lived in that house. They wanted to go up to his roof, jump onto our roof, and break into the house that way. Without losing a moment, I jumped from our roof to the Arab landlord's roof and began speaking convincingly, begging him not to acquiesce to their request. Using the little Arab that I knew, I managed to communicate with him. He agreed not to let the mob into his house. Okay, so you had righteous Arabs at that time because the relationships had been good till that time. His children, however, did not follow their father's example. They screamed out to the mob, "There's a Yahud here, there's a Yahud here." I stood near the Arab's window trying to figure out what to do. The Arab mob noticed me and brought their hatchets down on the door. The Arab landlord assured me, "You've nothing to worry about." The argument between my Arab and the mob intensified. The landlord told me to find a hiding place. I looked around. One of the pits used for household needs in his home seemed to be an excellent hiding place. The opening led to a place with something like a cellar. I moved aside the boards that covered the opening and crawled inside, replacing the boards after me. One of my friends had somehow managed to enter the Arab's house as well. When he couldn't find me, he began to worry. Again, this is history repeating itself. Now, we've all read its reports of Jews hiding in the sewers, during the Shoah. It's just history repeating itself time and again. When he couldn't find me, he began to worry. I removed some boards and told him to join me. Then another escapee arrived and another. There were now 4 or 5 of us hiding in the pit. The pit was a long underground passage that ran under the street. We continued walking, the sounds of the crazed mob right on top of us. We had also heard ear-splitting shrieks and cries. After waiting in the pit for a few hours, we realized that the storm had abated. We decided to leave our hiding place and return to the Lazarovsky's home. There was not a living soul on the street. The Shabbos table was still set. Mrs. Lazarovsky's 2 sons had been murdered. One of their young daughters, Devorah, and her father-in-law, Reb Aryeh Leib Gitalevsky, were also murdered. 3 generations at once. So that is 3 of their children and 3 generations at once, all being murdered. In actual fact, Kinnot Alei Tzion, we've got a slight link with the Hebron massacre. Ben Dodds Selaznik, one of our regular Mikpalalim, his great-great-uncle, Yisrael Shlomo Zelig Walensky, went to the Hebron Yeshiva in 1922. He was born in 1902 in Kosovo, and he was one of the martyrs of the Hebron massacre. And if you look on page 20, we've got just the last paragraph pointing out that this massacre was, the toll was very much felt by Chutz La'aretz. There weren't Israeli bochrim in those days. In those, nowadays you have Israeli shivot, and most of the Talmidim in the shivot are Israelis. There are lots of people from Chutz La'aretz, but mostly Israelis. Of course, everybody in those days would come from Chutz La'aretz, from Europe, but also from America. From Europe, I don't think it was necessarily such an enormous thing to go to Hebron. It was a long way away, but you were very often poor in Europe, so you were poor in Hebron. Of course, there were wealthy people in Europe, but it wasn't. Perhaps the dissonance wasn't so great. America was the golden medina. People were just starting to make it. Of course, there was great poverty in America in the early part of the 20th century. America then wasn't like the Upper West Side or the Five Towns of New Jersey is today. But nevertheless, you've made that shift. You've gone from Europe to America, to find a new life. And then there was a big question, it was a very big thing to send your children to Eretz Israel to learn in European conditions again. That was a very big thing. These people, even those Talmidim who weren't killed, were heroic. Page 20 points out that a special place is occupied by the American contingent, who received a double portion of the cup of tragedy from which we drank at the end of 5629. From the land of gold and silver they came to the city of the patriarchs, in order to dedicate their best years to the formation of their characters. What report did they hear? So they came. The combination of the two words, Slobodka and Chevel. They heard and they came. They dedicated themselves with all their ability to the great task of improvement, Aliyah, in order to return to their native land suffused with Torah and Yira, to bring light and warmth to their surroundings, to awaken the hearts of the young to follow in their paths with great dignity and great strength. More than once it seemed that with the smiles on their face they must have recognized the bliss that would be their future life. So did they grow and flourish, blossom and bear fruit on the fountains of Torah and Yira, flowers of grace, nobles of Israel, in whom is our glory and our pride. And suddenly, in the middle of the sunshine of the day, the axe was waved. The feller had come up. There is no word in the mouth, and no utterance on the tongue. Ki ein mina bilshoni, hein Adonai yadata kula. But lo, O Lord, you know it all together. So there's no Kinnot that I'm aware of written in memory of the victims of the Hebron massacre. We're going to look at one of the Anglo-Jewish Kinot today. We're going to look at the Kinnot on page 171 in the Rosenfeld Kinot. It's not in the other editions. It's the Kinnot for the Boppart and York martyrs of 1190. So we all know who the York martyrs were, and I remember as a kid always thinking it was very funny. Boppart, what a funny name was Boppart. Nobody ever knew who Boppart was. Who were the Boppart martyrs? So there doesn't seem to be a place called Boppart. But there's a place called Boppard in central Germany with a Dalet or a D at the end. And in 1179, there was a blood libel in Boppard. And that, Lichora, is the martyrs of Boppard, which was commemorated. There was also in the 1190s, in 1198, there was also a massacre in Boppard. It's interesting how, I don't know who Menachem ben Yaakov was who wrote this Kinnah. It's interesting that what's happened in York and what's happened in Germany, even in those days there was a link between them, even though it was a long way apart. and both of them were mourned. Of course, in York, there were Alei Tzion at the time of the York martyr and the York massacre. And obviously in Germany, there were also Alei Tzion. So this is the Kinot on page 171, being read for us by Roland.
Mahat Tanti Heret Osivaye, Lahati Tovima Shepanu Tishali, Betamiki, the LEA Hayam, Gamsham, the Shotati, Oi Heret Latmai Atana, Lo, Tishkoti, Nibu Yoshpe, even if Ratma Abayam, Ishkavo Kalaba in Payam, Ado, the each Lafine Ayam, Yardu, make it so tam ko, this Ye Hayam. Take him on Tamiladin, Sapa, Pasha to Savod, Pakinza, Pakata, Chapatu, Joy Hemi Day Sella, Nishmatu, the Elehem, every day, Rikmata, Nishatu, Miano Kule, Yopi Kule, Atora, Ebenin Ali Kala, Memshala, Ushara, the Bushe, Meltin, Bishve, Milkamashara, Eicha Nishpa, Mateo, Sakel, Gifara. Kentat Otsotam Lokam Dunekim, Lapulis von Efesh Bitzvah Hayim, Katsu Batayai Hevel, Kaedionim Batayanim, the Simulat Makavot, Iklazo Baim, Ita Im Yaflu Ademarom Anu, the God they provoket, when the Absol Betah Hikiru, Binto Tamale Kara, the Yitolalu, Kastu, the Zibot Palio Kalu. Tamim Pual Kamauto Bintiva Imedu Mikato Usaito Betova Ugiria Kala Oklato Bika El Hindil Katso Shoyeva Ram Komashek Akawadin El Feka Gemul Shif Atayim Litika El Hatike Haren Hukeka Mishalotam Becheshka Isma Ishmat Sadik Ikazan Akam Elam Kahapne Yesha, Yahava Havugeha Tefasefesha, Manalka Katagil, Shasha, Amadirka, Beda Marasha, Bazasit Bekam, Kolelai, Azamalaka, Zurid Goani, Minizim, Akib, Halalai,
The final Kinot that we read every year is, of course, the Kinot for the Shoah. Number of Kinot for the Shoah have been composed. We will read the Kinot in the Rosenfeld Kinot shortly. But, of course, the Shoah, in a certain sense, is the easiest of the tragedies for us to identify with. It's the most recent of them. There's still a few people left who are first generation survivors of the Shoah, certainly people who are second generation survivors. We've got lots of testimony about it, so in a certain sense it's the easiest of the tragedies for us to comprehend and identify with, but at the same time it's also the hardest because of the enormity of what happened. We look at the numbers of people who were killed in the Crusades. We look at the number of people who were killed in Hebron. How many people were killed in Hebron? 69 people were killed in Hebron. Because 69 people is a massacre. There was a massacre in Israel of 69 people in one day. You know, we would feel it to our very bones. But 69 is not 6 million. And when we talk about the number of 6 million, it's just an incomprehensible number. When we talk about over 1 million children being killed, it's an incomprehensible number for us to get our heads around. So simultaneously, the Shoah is both the easiest and the hardest of the tragedies for us to comprehend. Before we read the Kinot, I want to look at a passage from Elie Wiesel's book, Night. We're going to start in the middle of the chapter, that is the description of his arrival at Auschwitz and how he underwent the selection and what he saw, and then their response to their arrival at Auschwitz. So I'm reading on page 30 in the packet. The baton moved to the left. I took half a step forward. I wanted to see first where they were sending my father. If he went to the right, I would go after him. The baton once again pointed to the left for him too. A weight was lifted from my heart. We did not know yet which side, right or left. It led to prison and which to the crematory. But when I was happy, I was near my father. Our procession continued to move slowly forward. Another prisoner came up to us. Satisfied? Yes, someone. Poor devils, you're going to the crematory. He seemed to be telling the truth. Not far from us, flames were leaping up from a ditch, gigantic flames. They were burning something. A lorry drew up at the pit and delivered its load. Little children. Babies. Yes, I saw it with my own eyes, those children in the flames. Is it surprising that I could not sleep after that? Sleep had fed from my eyes. So this was where we were going. A little further on was another, and for adults. I pinched my face. Was I still alive? Was I awake? I could not believe it. How could it be possible for them to burn people, children, and for the world to keep silent? No, none of this could be true. It was a nightmare. Soon I should wake with a start, my heart pounding, to find myself back in the bedroom of my childhood, among my books. My father's voice drew me from my thoughts. It's a shame that you couldn't have gone with your mother. I saw several boys of your age going with their mothers. His voice was terribly sad, and I realized that he did not want to see what they were going to do to me. He did not want to see the burning of his only son. My forehead was bathed in cold sweat. But I told them that I did not believe they could burn people in our age, that humanity would never tolerate it. Humanity is not concerned with us. Today anything is allowed, anything is possible, even these crematories. His voice was choking. Father, I said, if that is so, I don't want to wait here. I'm going to run to the electric wire. That would be better than slow agony in the flames. He did not answer. He was weeping. His body was shaken convulsively. Around us, everyone was weeping. Someone began to recite the Kaddish, the prayer for the dead. I do not know if it has ever happened before in the long history of the Jews that people have ever recited the prayer for the dead for themselves. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei rabbah. May his name be blessed and magnified, whispered my father. For the first time, I felt revolt rise up in me. Why should I bless his name? The eternal Lord of the universe, the all-powerful and terrible, was silent. What had I to thank him for? We continued our march. We were gradually drawing closer to the ditch, from which an infernal heat was rising. Still 20 steps to go. I wanted to bring about my own death. This was the moment. Our line had now only 15 paces to cover. I bit my lips so that father would not hear my teeth chattering. 10 steps still, 8, 7. We marched slowly on, as though following a hearse at our own funeral. 4 steps more, 3 steps. That was it now. Right in front of us, the pit and its flames. I gathered all that was left in my strength so that I could break from the ranks and throw myself upon the barbed wire. In the depths of my heart, I bade farewell to my father, to the whole universe, and in spite of myself, the words formed themselves and issued in a whisper from my lips. Yitkadal, Yitkadash, Shemei Rabbah. May his name be blessed and magnified. My heart was bursting. The moment had come. I was face to face with the angel of death. No. 2 steps from the pit, we were ordered to turn to the left and made to go into a barracks. I pressed my father's hand. He said, do you remember Madame Schafter in the train? Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, 7 times cursed and 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of the children, whose bodies I saw turned into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. Never shall I forget those flames which consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget that nocturnal silence which deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to dust. Never shall I forget these things, even if I'm condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. So this, of course, is an immensely moving passage. The notion of saying Kaddish for yourself in Auschwitz. And Elie Wiesel was, of course, an immensely heroic and complex character. In the one paragraph, he says, "Never shall I forget those moments which murdered my God and soul." He feels that he's lost his faith. And in the very next sentence, he writes, "Even if I'm condemned to live as long as God himself," God with a capital G, himself with a capital H. This man who's lost his faith, who still believes in God, having lost his faith, but still believing in God. That is the complexity of it. The notion of losing faith in the Shoah and still believing in God, of course, asking that question of Eicha, how can it be? Where was God in the Shoah? I want to quote from Rabbi Sachs, Zichrono Livracha. If you go onto Rabbi Sachs's website, you can find a number of conversations he had about the Shoah. Well worth listening to on Tisha B'Av afternoon. Part one, he addresses the question of where do you think God was in the Holocaust? And I want to share with you what he said. He said, "Faith for me is an intensely personal experience. And clearly there are many responses to the question, where was God in the Holocaust? But all I can tell you is mine. The first time I went to Auschwitz, I was simply overwhelmed. I stood in Auschwitz-Birkenau on the train tracks that brought Jews from all over Europe to be gassed, burned and turned to ash. The Nazis actually endangered their own war effort in order to divert trains to this relentless evil for evil's sake. I went through Stammhelgerg Auschwitz, seeing the suitcases, the spectacles, the glasses, the hair. The Nazis kept everything. Everything was worth keeping, except one thing, human life. I could not believe that. They kept the suitcases, and they killed 1.25 million people, 250,000 children. And then I saw the photographs, because in Auschwitz, the first people who were sent to Auschwitz were photographed. Of course, they stopped that quite soon, but there were photographs of 4, 5, 6, 7-year-old children. I just broke down, I wept, I asked myself, God, where were you? And words came into my mind. I'm not claiming they were any kind of revelation, but this is what they said. I was in the words, you shall not murder. I was in the words, you shall not oppress a stranger. I was in the words that were said to Cain when he killed Abel. Your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And suddenly I knew that when God speaks and human beings refuse to listen, even God is helpless in that situation. He knew that Cain was about to kill Abel, but he didn't stop him. He knew Pharaoh was about to kill Israelite children. He didn't stop it. God gives us freedom and he never takes it back. But he tells us how to use that freedom. And when human beings refuse to listen, even God is powerless. And then there is the second answer. This one came to me from Holocaust survivors, many of whom told me that they felt God was personally with them, giving them the strength and courage to survive. There were people who lost their faith at Auschwitz. There were people who kept their faith. And there were people who found faith in Auschwitz. To my mind, one of the most moving stories is the one Viktor Frankl told about himself. When he first came to Auschwitz, they stripped him of everything, his clothes, his identity, and the one thing that was most precious to him apart from his wife and family, which was the book he'd written. He said, when they took that from me, my life was over. And of course, they took their clothes and they sent them all into a shower. And he was expecting that to be death. But he was one of the lucky ones. It was just a shower. And afterwards they gave him clothes of people who'd been killed. And he put on these clothes and he found something in one of the pockets. He took it out and saw that it was a scrap of paper. It had been torn from a siddur, from a prayer book. And it contained these words, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your good, the Lord is one. V'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And Frankel said, these words transfixed me. They were saying to me, now you must live. Every single thing you ever taught and practiced, you must live that here, now, in Auschwitz. And that gave him the courage to do what he did, which was to give people the will to live. So that is where God was in the Holocaust. He was in the commands, in the sanctity of life that was so cruelly and devastatingly unheard. And in the hearts of some of the survivors who found God, giving them the strength. Our minhag is that we read this Kinot together. Eicha tifarteinu meirashenu hishlachta, Eicha panecha mimenu histarta, Eicha katsafta v'lo chamalta. B'leiv nishba v'nivkeh b'yom tzara v'atzara, Banu l'fanecha lispod v'livkot b'china v'ilala, V'zochreinu et kedoshei HaShoah, tartzat tasha. Go'on Yaakov asher ahavta shibarta, Gadata ramei hakoma v'advoin nishbalta, Gafneinu l'shamal teinatenu l'tzapa asamta, Davku atzameinu l'oreinu v'sareinu, Dachodikita la'aretz chayenu, Dalfa mituga v'anachna nafsheinu, Hane'havim v'animim v'yisharim v'atmimim, Utanu b'akronot kichbasim v'karim, Achom machanat v'aptachim chatumim, Vatikim yoshim al ha'aretz domimim, V'meha etachatatam hem shoalim, V'lava nigzar hadin v'lei rachamim, Zachot zizgoet zakat anavim, Zakat ha'ifamim ha'galmudim ha'nezavim, Zilzul chachamim v'talmideihem ha'ahuvim, Chayalim Rashei Beit Avot Giborim, Chalalim Umedukarim, Nafrim Milyonim, Cherpa Mishama Haitza Lagoyim, Tipach Mibri Binu Haftat Kilam Hashimam, Karov Tarfu Gizebim Mishpoch Damam, Tevach Sheish Meot Ribo Mizamam, Yardu Chaim Shol HaBishma Yisrael Ubaneim Amen. Yasu mishmoshem umutarim betalit tefillin yevoshem yikamu v'yuchayin harotzchim kala she'ereinu v'abeinu shevet chalkeinu kulanu nosim pina v'ovdan chatzi ameinu ishkula shoah t'sreifat beit Eloheinu la'Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Meidanik v'Treblinka L'chuvut chukub b'chadrei gazlis l'chuvut b'moktos hakif shanim b'cherpa L'achamu ha'kdoshim ha'torim v'naflu k'giborim v'geto barsha Mikol pina zoakim d'mehem ha'krushim Matai avokeitz l'apgayim ha'anushim Mispeit mar b'kina s'luah ha'kdoshim Na'achsu ha'noatim et ha'bris v'et ha'ateinu Naflu aleinu b'chofecha v'nivkeh v'asom nafshenu Nafla teret rosheinu Oy na l'nachalatenu Sifrei Torah l'gzarim karu v'tinu b'teihem Salku b'sar she'ereinu V'oram hafku l'kishuteihem Siftu b'chigru v'sak v'heililu alehem v'yal tafeihem Einenu zol got da'am z'maot Al Shreifat Batei Knesiot, Al Arisat Yeshivot, Batei Midrashot, Parsu Giloteinu, Marsu Adateinu, Pachad Pranu, Radach Azatanu, Hanenu Kista Kelima, Besaroteinu, Sia Arukur, Becheser, Bechafan, Tnuah B'nafshan, Shalchu Yadan, Tzaka b'yamsuf, nishma kolan. Krovim, vididim, chavidim, chasidim, nisharim. Kedoshim v'torim, kezar harakia maskirim. Kabbalei mahastirei v'seitek nafech alolamim. Rachum zechov rachamecha, tzvidei nachalatecha. Ribon ha'olamim, aster dagav v'zugam me'amecha. Rishas hagoyim rishasonei Yisrael, takeh v'zamecha. Shuyim hadrer v'kachach asureinu. Shemen sason tachatei vel tatreinu. Shalom v'shalvat sasim lanu arteinu. Tarin, Karnein, Takesh, Dulatenu, Bim, Herav Yamenu, Tagerava, Tifrach, Kachavat Selet, Israel, Medinatenu, Tavarachenu, Bebirkat, Abraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Avotenu. Of course, this Kinot finishes on a hopeful, perhaps almost triumphant note. I want to conclude our study by sharing with you words of Moriv Rabbi Harav Lichtenstein Zichrono Livracha, who wrote about that sense of light that does appear at the end of the tunnel. He describes that you go to Yad Vashem. If anybody's been to the new Yad Vashem, you might have been to the old Yad Vashem. Worth going to the new Yad Vashem. Go through the new Yad Vashem, you spend an hour or two. It's dark, it's dismal, and then it's immensely clever at the end. You get to the end, and you come out into the sunlight, and you see the Jerusalem hills there, and you just realize that amongst the tragedy, there is the chance for rebuilding as well. If you've never been there, if you haven't been to the new Yad Vashem, it's worth going and immersing yourself in 2 hours of misery to come out at the end. I've given you the plot spoiler, as it were. Spoiled it for you. I remember the first time I was there, after we rebuilt, it's dismal, it's heavy. You come out at the end and you just gasp. In addition to devoting rededicated efforts to Knesset Israel and the Torah of Israel, let us also take up the task they never had, the opportunity to accomplish, building and developing the land of Israel. Anyone who emerges from Yad Vashem experiences profound depression, and quite understandably so. But when you emerge and see the hills of Judea and Jerusalem rebuilt, you can take some comfort. We should not attempt to do an accounting and say that this is God's compensation to us for the Holocaust. The state of Israel is not the solution to that problem, but rather an opportunity for us to fulfill a mission. It is not an answer, but rather a challenge and a destiny. And our responsibility is to work towards its realization. We're going to finish with Alei Tzion. Alei Tzion is a Kinot. We get it wrong every year. We sing it the wrong way. I'm convinced that we sing it the wrong way. It's a dirge, and it's saying that there's no time to stop dirging. There's no time to stop lamenting. We've spent all morning saying Kinnot, talking about the destruction of Yerushalayim, the destruction of Beit HaMikdash, the destruction of the Jewish people. And these are things that go on time and time again from generation to generation. These things are never going to stop till it's all over, until the Beit HaMikdash is rebuilt. In the modern era, it's of course difficult to identify fully with the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So many things are good for us, so many things have been restored to us. At the same time, Yerushalayim still lies in ruins, and we're still mourning for the destruction of Yerushalayim. So as we sing Alei Tzion, let's try to perhaps sing it in a way a little bit more low-key than perhaps some shuls do. And remember, this is a dirge and an elegy as well. Alei Tzion ve'yareha, k'moni Shabbat zireha, v'chibser lach ha'gurasai, ha'ureha, Alei Aroin Asher Nutat, ve'asmatzoi nadareha, ve'aliyah v'choreyel, v'sol mitach nadareha, Alei Gavut v'shamreyel, Na'ilei shir zamareha, V'yaltava asher shubal, V'loi meinei yahoireha, Alei egoin v'foineha, Asher zoman v'yareha, V'yaltava asher shomein, U'v'tzuz ahereha, Alei zifrei
Samineha, with your name of Horeha, beyond the Eicha, Mizrach Toreha, Alei Tzion, B'nei Dovid Yevireha, V'yad Yom Yom Asher Kosham, V'yesorut V'soreha, Alei Kavod Asher Galot, V'yesor Nevireha, V'yad Loiches Asher Locham, V'sham Sakim Hadoreha, Alei Mahas V'roi Makois, Asher Ruku Nezireha, V'yad Nivus Alei Selah, Oilameh Adoreha, Alei Simcha Zoreha, V'soreha, Hallelujah, B'nei Korin, Alei Meshach Asher Oksah, Shalom Derech Ashureha, V'yasi Voice Kehaleho, Shufeha Nefayreha, Alei Koilos Nefarveha, V'eis Amut Legoreha, V'yal Rishas Legadeha, V'soif Mishkan Vaseireha, Alei Shimcha Terkulah, V'fi Kavei Vaseireha, V'yal Tachan Yinzakulah, V'shoy V'shma Havareha, Alei Tzion V'yareha, V'mo Isha V'tzireha, V'chim Sulach Agurasa, Al-Mahal Le'ureha.
Ten Rabbis kasher amata, Cholenei kasher dibarta, Maher shal tachishuna, v'tashub Yerushalayim rachamim rabbeim, kakatuvay admiach halachin kol Adonai, shavti Yerushalayim rachamim beiti baleva, Lu'um Adonai tzvot, kali natel Yerushalayim ne'emar, od kara le'mo kol Adonai tzvot, עוד תפוצן הרי מצוב, וניחם אדוני ציון, ואחר עוד בירושלים נאמר, כי ניחם אדוני ציון, ניחם כל חורבותיה, וישם מדברה כעדן וערבצה כגן אדוני, ששון ושמחה ימצא בה, תודה וכל זמרה.